He once stared into a universe that didn't know him, and for a moment, just a fraction of a breath, it felt like everything familiar had dissolved into something quiet and strange. The stars still shone, but they hummed differently, as though they remembered a different story than the one he had lived. He blinked, uncertain, and the light shifted, softening around the edges, revealing not chaos, but a gentle emptiness. A calm he didn't know he wanted. Before we begin the story, I want to say something quietly and sincerely. We truly love and care for you. You're here, taking this time for yourself, and that matters. It matters more than the universe sometimes realizes. And now, tell me, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Take a moment to notice it. Notice yourself. Now, if you like, grab your coffee or your tea or maybe just a warm blanket. And let's get started. Rick wasn't always the man who could rip open the fabric of reality like it was a napkin. Once he had been a boy with a crooked grin and oversized shoes, staring at the sky with wide, wondering eyes. He would lie in the grass, arms spread, and imagine the clouds moving in ways no one else could see. Sometimes he imagined worlds floating above the clouds, delicate and spinning like lullabies, each with a story he could only guess at. Those stories whispered to him, softly, as though they wanted to be remembered. And he listened. He listened so carefully that the sound of leaves in the wind, the distant bark of a dog, the quiet hum of a neighbor's clock, all became music he understood in a way nobody else could. Even then, he noticed the small things. A lost coin glinting in a puddle. The way sunlight pooled on the floorboards. The faint scent of a book left open in the sun. Other children ran and shouted, fought and dreamed loudly, but Rick found meaning in these smaller, quieter rhythms. He didn't know it yet, but these moments were shaping him, making him sensitive to the pulse of the world, preparing him for the places he would someday visit, and for the people he would quietly touch without ever realizing it. And then came the first sparks of curiosity. Those soft little flames that would eventually roar into invention. He built things always, not because he had to, but because the world seemed incomplete until he added his touch. A broken toy, a cracked cup, a bent bicycle wheel. Each became a miniature universe under his hands. And when something worked, even just for a moment, he would sit back and feel a quiet, deep happiness. The kind that doesn't shout but lingers in your chest, in your bones. That was his first taste of joy. The universe has a strange way of noticing those who pay attention. Sometimes it speaks to them in whispers. Rick learned early that the world was full of doors, some visible, some not, and that each door led somewhere unexpected. He didn't always understand the language of those doors. Sometimes they demanded patience, sometimes courage, sometimes nothing more than quiet observation. He learned to wait, to watch, to feel the subtle pull of possibility. And in those early years, even when no one else saw it, Rick began to practice listening. It wasn't always easy. Loneliness crept in, soft and persistent, like a shadow across the grass at sunset. Other children didn't always understand him. They didn't hear the hum of the clouds or the gentle stories hiding in the leaves. They didn't notice the weight of a single raindrop or the way light bent differently in certain corners of the room. And so Rick learned another quiet skill, to exist in the silence without fear, to find companionship in the unspoken rhythms of the world, to trust that the universe was talking even when no one else was listening. One day, when the sky was painted with the pink gold of an early evening, he found a small, broken watch in the dirt. Its glass face was cracked, and the hands spun randomly, as though time itself had given up on it. Rick picked it up carefully, feeling the weight of its tiny mechanisms and the history it carried. And in that small, circular universe of gears and springs, he saw something he couldn't explain, a kind of quiet magic. Not loud, not spectacular, but subtle, the kind that bends the edges of your perception just enough to notice the world differently. He fixed it in the way a gentle hand smooths a crumpled page, and for a brief moment the watch ticked in perfect rhythm. He smiled softly, the sound barely more than a whisper, but it echoed in the air, in the trees, in the clouds above, in the infinite possibilities of the unseen universe around him. Even then, Rick didn't know he was being shaped for a life that would one day stretch across worlds. He didn't know that the quiet skills he cherished, observation, empathy, patience, the art of noticing what others overlooked, would become his greatest tools. He didn't know that one day he would stare into universes that had no memory of him, and that in doing so, he would understand more deeply than ever the delicate threads that connect every being, every choice, every moment. And so, as he stood in that strange, forgotten universe, the one that had blinked and failed to remember him, Rick felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not fear, not anger, not loneliness, but a gentle, soft awe. The kind of awe you feel when you watch sunlight spill over a quiet meadow, or when you hear a lullaby sung to someone you love. He let it wash over him, slow and patient, and he realized that even if the universe forgot him, the world, the real, breathing, listening world, was still full of quiet beauty, still full of moments waiting to be noticed, moments waiting to be loved, and somewhere in the hush of that evening, Rick closed his eyes and let the gentle hum of existence settle around him. He didn't need to fix everything, not yet. For now he simply breathed, and he remembered how to listen, how to notice, how to care. And as he did, the universe seemed to lean closer just a little, as though it had been waiting for him to see it, truly see it, all along. Rick's childhood smelled faintly of wet grass, old books and the metallic tang of his father's toolbox. The world was vast and strange, even in small ways. A crooked fence, a quiet alleyway, the way shadows leaned differently depending on the hour. He wandered these spaces slowly, learning the rhythms of things unnoticed by other children. Sometimes he spoke to broken toys he found in the dust, imagining them as small companions, waiting for someone to notice their stories. And in those quiet conversations, Rick began to understand that attention itself could be a kind of magic. Gentle, transformative, subtle. He had friends in his own way, though they were often silent ones. A tree with knotted roots that bent like an old man's fingers. A puddle where clouds briefly rested. A stray cat who appeared only when he felt lonely, as though she existed just for him. These companions didn't speak back, not with words, but their presence was enough. Rick learned early that connection didn't always need sound or explanation. Some bonds were formed in quiet observation, in small gestures, in the mere act of noticing and caring. School was a peculiar place for him. Other children shouted and raced, and teachers often dismissed his questions as odd or irrelevant. But Rick noticed patterns they never did. He saw the way numbers danced subtly across the blackboard, the way the chalk left tiny, delicate clouds of dust that shimmered in sunlight. He saw that one question could lead to 10 more questions and 10 more universes of thought. And though he sometimes felt isolated, he carried a secret sense of wonder, knowing that there was more beneath the surface than anyone else seemed to notice. Even at this young age, Rick's mind wandered farther than the streets he walked. On afternoons when the sun fell low, he would sit on the curb and trace invisible paths in the air with his fingers, as if he could map the currents of time and thought itself. He imagined worlds tucked between the folds of clouds, spinning silently, untouched by noise or distraction. Some days he would close his eyes and hear their soft voices, like wind brushing against leaves, murmuring secrets he could not yet fully understand. These murmurs became a kind of lullaby, comforting him when the world felt too loud or too fast. His family, too, existed in a haze of quiet complexity. His father was often busy with work, with the rhythms of life that didn't pause for wonder. His mother tried, in her own gentle way, to reach him, but Rick was always halfway in some other world, caught between curiosity and imagination. And though he sometimes felt misunderstood, he carried no resentment. Instead, he learned the art of patience. He learned that sometimes love wasn't loud or declarative. It was in the small acts. A hand held, a word carefully chosen, a moment of shared silence. Rick's first experiments with invention were delicate, almost tender. He began with small things: a wheel that spun more smoothly than it should, a toy that could move without being pushed, a tiny contraption that measured the way sunlight bent in a window. Each success was soft, almost secret, celebrated only by him and the faint hum of satisfaction that filled the room. These early experiments weren't about recognition or applause. They were about understanding, about noticing the small mysteries of life and learning how to interact with them. Each little creation was a whisper into the universe, a signal that he existed and observed, that he noticed the subtle patterns others overlooked. And then came the moments of wonder, the ones that stayed with him even now, woven into the marrow of his being. The first time he saw lightning stretch across the sky like a fragile finger tracing a secret message. The first time he found a snail glistening in the rain and watched its tiny world unfold in slow motion. The first time he discovered that by carefully bending a piece of wire, he could create a shape that caught the light and seemed to hum softly. These moments were never loud or celebrated, yet they filled him with a quiet kind of awe, the kind that made him feel both infinitesimally small and infinitely connected. Rick's quirks became the roots of who he was. The way he noticed patterns in the clouds, the way he lingered on details others missed, the way he could sit for hours listening to the faintest hum of life. All of these would shape the man who could one day traverse universes. They became more than habits. They became a kind of intuition, a map for understanding the unseen threads connecting beings, places, and moments. And even though childhood sometimes felt lonely, these quirks gave him companionship that was steady, gentle, and endlessly patient. One evening, as the sky turned lavender and gold, Rick wandered to the edge of a small creek near his house. He had no particular reason to be there. He was simply drawn, as if some unseen hand guided him. The water reflected the fading sun like liquid glass, and in it he saw more than his own reflection. He saw a possibility, a glimmer of a path he would one day walk, where he would leave echoes in worlds he had not yet discovered. He didn't fully understand it, of course. He only felt it, a soft, insistent pull towards something vast, quiet and extraordinary. It was there, beside that creek, that Rick realized something he wouldn't say aloud for many years. The universe has patience. It does not demand. It does not rush. It waits quietly for those who are willing to notice it, to listen to its subtle cues, to respond not with grand gestures, but with small, deliberate, meaningful acts. And Rick, even as a boy, understood that he wanted to be someone who noticed, someone who could attend to the small miracles that others often overlooked, someone who could quietly, gently make a difference. And so childhood for Rick was a series of soft awakenings. Each day offered something new, a discovery, a quiet act of kindness, a lesson in observation, a reminder that attention itself could be a gift. He wandered through alleys, gardens, and forests, always watching, always learning, always quietly shaping the inner life that would one day stretch across realities. He didn't know yet that the friends he hadn't spoken to, the trees he had whispered to, the puddles he had watched, all of these small, unnoticed companions were preparing him for the gentle heroism he would one day practice, the quiet care he would extend to the ones he loved, and the delicate understanding he would carry through universes that might forget him, but never the echoes of what he noticed. As the evening deepened, Rick returned home, his pockets filled with tiny treasures, a smooth stone, a feather, a bent paperclip that reminded him of the intricate paths of rivers. He placed them carefully on his bedside table, arranging them just so, and lay down, gazing out the window. The first stars appeared, faint and hesitant, like shy children peeking from behind a curtain. And in that moment, Rick let himself feel the gentle comfort of the world, of skies, of night, of the slow, persistent beauty that had always surrounded him. Even in the quiet of a house that slept around him, he was awake to wonder. He closed his eyes slowly, allowing the day's observations to drift softly into his mind. He felt, for the first time in a profound way, that being small did not mean being insignificant, that noticing, caring, and observing quietly were acts of courage and acts of love, that even the smallest, most overlooked life could hold worlds within it, just waiting to be seen. And somewhere, in the hush of that lavender evening, young Rick dreamed gently of the universes he would one day visit, of the moments he would one day influence without fanfare, and of the quiet, enduring power of simply paying attention. Rick never expected the first portal to open the way it did. It happened quietly, almost lazily, on an afternoon when sunlight spilled through his bedroom window in golden rectangles that danced on the floor. He had been tinkering with a small device, a fragile collection of wires and springs, not thinking it would do anything at all. But then, with a faint hum, a circle of light blossomed in the air before him, shimmering like a reflection on water. It was soft, warm, inviting, and it seemed almost alive. He paused, staring at it. And in that pause, something remarkable happened. He felt welcomed. The universe on the other side was not threatening. It did not demand cleverness, bravery, or answers. It only existed like a deep, inhaled breath, a slow rhythm of possibility that matched his own heartbeat. Rick reached out, hesitated, and then stepped forward. The moment he crossed, the world seemed to fold gently around him, not violently or chaotically, but in the way a page folds when turned carefully, without tearing. Colors that did not exist in his own sky swirled lazily above him, soft blues and pinks and silvers that reminded him of twilight clouds and distant stars. The air smelled faintly of rain, and something sweet he could not name, as though the universe had created a perfume just for him. And in that quiet, strange beauty, Rick felt a wonder he had never known before. The universe was small, intimate, almost like a hidden garden waiting behind a familiar wall. Trees grew in gentle spirals, their leaves shimmering in translucent layers. Tiny rivers whispered across mossy stones, carrying reflections that seemed to tell stories without words. And in the distance, he could hear a soft hum, almost like a lullaby sung by 1,000 tiny voices, layered and harmonized, barely audible but unmistakably present. It made the hairs on his arms stand up, not in fear, but in awe. Rick wandered slowly, touching the soft bark of the spiral trees, letting the water trickle over his fingers, listening to the faint hum as it rippled around him. Every movement was careful, deliberate, a silent conversation with the world that had opened itself to him. He noticed patterns in the way light danced over the river, the way shadows curved gently around the trees, the way small creatures, almost invisible, barely perceptible, moved in unison as though guided by some invisible symphony. It was not a universe that demanded anything of him. It only asked that he pay attention, that he notice, that he care. Hours passed, though he did not count them. Time in this universe moved differently, slower, allowing thought to stretch and bloom without pressure. Rick found himself sitting by a small crystalline pond, watching the colors shift like liquid dreams. He saw his reflection, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to simply exist without expectation, without judgment. And in that existence, he felt a quiet joy, a soft satisfaction that grew from being present, from noticing the tiniest miracles and acknowledging them, even in silence. He built small things there too, not machines that hummed or sparked, not inventions meant to impress, but delicate arrangements of stones, sticks, and water that caught the light in unexpected ways. Each creation felt like a conversation, a tiny message left for the universe and for himself, a sign that he had been there, that he had seen, that he had appreciated. The universe did not applaud. It only shimmered in response, and Rick understood that was enough. He slept there too, on a bed of moss that was soft and fragrant. The stars above pulsed gently, in a rhythm that seemed to echo his own heartbeat. He dreamed of patterns and spirals, of tiny creatures dancing in invisible circles, of whispers that hinted at places beyond places, of universes waiting quietly to be noticed. And when he awoke, he did so with a feeling of calm he had never carried home from his own world. The first universe he loved had given him something more valuable than knowledge or adventure. It had given him the experience of being fully, quietly seen. In the following days, Rick returned often, each visit a small pilgrimage. He did not always know why he was drawn back. Sometimes it was curiosity, sometimes a need for calm, sometimes a desire to leave behind small creations that might last longer than he could imagine. And each time he discovered something new. A ripple in a pond that spelled a message in light. A tree whose branches formed an intricate spiral he had not noticed before. A soft trill in the air that spoke in patterns. Almost like words he could almost understand. He began to imagine that perhaps the universe was not just something to explore, but something to learn from. Each creature, each ripple, each flicker of light carried meaning if one only paid attention. And he did. He paid attention more fully than anyone else seemed capable of doing, listening to things without needing an explanation, observing without demanding comprehension, allowing the world to teach him in ways that were subtle, gentle, and profound. And still, even in this quiet joy, he noticed a strange ache, the awareness that this universe, so soft and welcoming, might not be permanent, that the beauty he found there could vanish in a blink or fold into some other shape beyond his understanding. But even that awareness was not fearful. It was part of the quiet lesson he was learning, that beauty and joy, once noticed, remain with you, even if the world shifts, even if the universe changes. That the act of noticing is itself an inheritance, a memory carried in the mind and heart. One evening, as the lavender sky deepened to a soft indigo, Rick sat by a small waterfall that shimmered with an inner light. He closed his eyes, letting the sound fill him completely, and for the first time he felt the beginnings of a purpose he would not yet name. Not fame, not discovery, not even invention itself, but something gentler, something quieter, the desire to carry this attention, this careful noticing into the worlds he would inhabit, to touch lives, to leave soft marks of care, to shape experience through empathy rather than force. It was in that first universe that Rick understood a fundamental truth, though he would not phrase it in words until much later, that the heart of a hero is not always in what they conquer, but in what they perceive, in what they protect quietly, in what they notice when no one else is watching. And in that understanding, he felt a calm that stretched across dimensions, a quiet joy that hummed like the softest lullaby, a knowledge that even in silence, even in absence, one could make a difference simply by being aware, by being present, by caring. When he finally returned to his own world, the portal closing behind him with a faint sigh, Rick carried the universe in his mind like a secret treasure. It whispered to him still in moments of quiet reflection, reminding him that there were spaces untouched, stories unspoken, wonders unnoticed, and that his task, perhaps his gentle, lifelong task, was to move through life paying attention, leaving behind subtle echoes of care and understanding wherever he could. And in the hush of his bedroom, with evening stars beginning to shimmer outside the window, Rick smiled softly. He realized that universes could be loved quietly, without demand, without expectation, and that such love was powerful in ways that shouted softly, reverberated gently, and lasted forever in the heart of the one who truly noticed. Rick's world was always full of small wonders, yet it was also a place of solitude. He had wandered through forgotten alleys, quiet gardens, and strange universes, carrying the hum of things unnoticed. And then one ordinary afternoon, Morty arrived, not with fanfare or an announcement, but quietly, almost like a breeze slipping under a door, changing the air in a room without anyone noticing until the warmth lingered. Morty was uncertain, shy and easily startled, the opposite of Rick in almost every way. But Rick noticed him immediately, not just with his eyes, but with the quiet attention he had practiced since childhood. There was something in the way Morty tilted his head, hesitant, absorbing the world slowly, that reminded Rick of himself long ago. The boy's nervous energy was soft and unpolished, yet there was a kind of gentle curiosity hiding beneath it, the same subtle spark that had drawn Rick to strange universes before he even understood them. Their first interaction was awkward. Morty fumbled over words, over gestures, over the sheer fact of existing in Rick's unpredictable presence. Rick, in turn, was blunt but not unkind, his sharp observation softened by the undercurrent of care that he rarely admitted aloud. "Relax," he said, in his own quiet way. "You don't have to solve everything at once." Morty blinked, unsure what that meant, but the words settled around him like a small, protective blanket. And so began the slow, tender weaving of their bond, not through grand adventures or heroic feats, but through small acts, shared moments, quiet observations. Rick showed Morty the subtle magic of noticing, the way sunlight caught on a puddle, the tiny variations in the hum of machinery, the soft rhythm of stars spinning silently above. Morty learned, slowly, to pay attention, to care in ways that didn't require loud gestures or bold statements. And Rick, in turn, found his own heart expanding quietly, warmed by the presence of someone who needed care, and who, in return, offered attention without pretense. There were afternoons spent in the garage, tinkering on devices neither fully understood. Rick guided Morty patiently, not with commands, but with gentle corrections and soft encouragements. "Try again," he would say, voice low and even, "but notice the little details. Listen to what it's trying to tell you." Morty's hands trembled, his focus scattered at first, but slowly he learned the art of careful observation. The machines didn't always work. Often they did not. But the process mattered more than the results. In those quiet hours, a trust grew between them, invisible but steady. Outside the garage, they wandered through the neighborhood, exploring small corners that most children ignored. Rick taught Morty to listen to the world in a different way, the faint creak of a fence bending in the wind, the whisper of leaves as if exchanging secrets, the quiet way sunlight pooled on uneven pavement. Morty noticed things he had never seen before, and Rick watched him notice, quietly proud, though he rarely spoke the pride aloud. Words were unnecessary. The shared attention, the shared wonder, was enough. Rick also taught Morty, indirectly, the value of patience and empathy. When Morty stumbled, when he became frustrated or afraid, Rick did not scold or rush. He simply observed, sometimes offering a word, sometimes not, allowing Morty to find his own balance. "The world isn't in a hurry," Rick said once, softly, watching Morty's hands tremble as he tried to fix a small, humming device. "Neither should you be." It was a lesson that echoed far beyond the garage, into Morty's understanding of life itself. And yet, Rick never lost the sense of wonder that had drawn him to other universes. He shared glimpses of it with Morty, gently, not as instructions, but as invitations. They would lie on rooftops at dusk, watching clouds spiral and shimmer, and Rick would hum faintly a tune that seemed to belong to the sky itself. Morty would hum back, unsure of the notes, but in that small, imperfect harmony, something beautiful emerged. It was not perfection, it was presence, and it was enough. They shared other small rituals too, sandwiches on the porch while the sun sank low, quiet walks through empty streets, evenings watching the first stars blink awake in the sky. Rick began to notice subtle patterns in Morty's movements, the way he shifted when nervous, the way his eyes lingered on small, luminous details, the way his laughter was gentle but genuine when something surprised him. And Morty, in turn, began to notice Rick in ways no one else did. The faint tremor in his hands when he was deep in thought, the way his eyes softened when he wasn't pretending to be indifferent, the quiet hum of his presence in the garage and the garden and the rooms of their house, and still, it wasn't all easy. Morty's uncertainty sometimes collided with Rick's impatience, a friction that sparked small tensions. But even in those moments, there was a soft undercurrent of understanding. Rick never raised his voice unnecessarily, and Morty, over time, began to trust that missteps would not lead to rejection. Theirs was a bond built on careful observation, on the soft acknowledgement of each other's struggles, on the quiet insistence that they were not alone, even when the world felt indifferent. Rick also began to see his own childhood reflected in Morty's cautious curiosity. He remembered the long hours spent noticing patterns, the quiet joy of discovering small miracles, the soft ache of being misunderstood. And in guiding Morty, he discovered a new layer of patience and tenderness within himself. A gentle heroism he had never noticed before. Small acts of care, soft words of guidance, quiet attention to someone else's needs. These were his true adventures now, delicate and meaningful, stretching across the days like invisible threads. There were nights when Morty would fall asleep in the garage, head resting on a coil of wires, and Rick would watch him breathe, feeling an unfamiliar warmth in his chest. He didn't always understand it. He didn't always name it, but the sensation was persistent, soft and undeniable. He had never been responsible for anyone in this quiet, attentive way before, and it reshaped him gently, imperceptibly. Even his genius, usually a sharp, jagged force, softened in Morty's presence, becoming a steady current of care rather than an explosive display of brilliance. By the end of that first year together, Rick realized something quietly remarkable. He was no longer completely alone in his observations, in his fascination with subtle beauty, in his patient attention to the hidden rhythms of life. Morty had become a companion in noticing, a fellow traveler in quiet wonder. He was not just a nephew, not just a student. He was a small mirror of all the things Rick had carried in his solitude, reflecting back lessons learned and care extended, reminding Rick that connection, even tentative and soft, was a kind of universe all its own. And in the quiet moments, when the garage was dim and the stars outside shimmered faintly through the window, Rick would think to himself, softly, almost to himself, almost as a whisper, that perhaps, in some small way, Morty was teaching him as much as he was teaching Morty, that the act of caring, noticing and sharing space with another being, even quietly, even imperfectly, was a form of heroism just as vital as any that could span universes. And somewhere, in the hush of that evening, Rick allowed himself a small smile. He realized that the first step in any journey, even one that would one day stretch across infinite realities, was simply presence, simply noticing, simply caring. And he was no longer alone in that. Morty was there, a small, trembling presence with soft eyes and a slow, deliberate heartbeat, and together they were beginning to understand the quiet, enduring magic of paying attention, of being present. of loving gently without demand or expectation. Rick's experiments had always begun quietly, in the low hum of the garage or the soft scratch of his pencil against paper. But this particular day carried a different weight, an almost imperceptible tension in the air, like the pause before a lullaby begins. He was bent over a workbench, strewn with wires, glass files, and scraps of metal, moving slowly, deliberately, as if each gesture itself were part of a conversation with the universe. The devices he tinkered with were not meant to impress, not meant to spark or explode. They were gestures of attention, small mirrors held up to the world, catching fragments of possibility and reflecting them softly back. Morty hovered nearby, nervously twiddling a pencil and watching the delicate arrangements of circuits and lenses.
Rick?
He said, voice hesitant. Do you ever worry that you're poking at things you shouldn't? Rick glanced up, his eyes soft beneath the rim of his goggles.
Everything can be dangerous if you're not paying attention, he said quietly.
But the point isn't to avoid danger. The point is to notice it, to understand it, to move carefully through it. Morty nodded, unsure if he truly understood, but trusting Rick's tone more than his words. And in that trust, a small thread of connection was woven between them, invisible but steady. The hum of the machines was almost meditative. Rick listened to it as if it were music, a symphony composed of wires, coils, and the faint resonance of possibility itself. Each device vibrated with potential, carrying the whisper of universes waiting quietly to be discovered, understood, or gently nudged into existence. The edges of reality seemed thinner here, more malleable, more alive. Rick reached out with his mind as much as his hands, sensing the faint rhythms beneath the hum, patterns that danced just beyond comprehension. Hours passed, though they felt like minutes. Morty tried to assist, fumbling and hesitating, but Rick guided him patiently, demonstrating that failure was not something to fear, but something to observe.
See, Rick murmured, holding up a tiny lens to catch a sliver of refracted light.
Even a small misstep can teach you more than a perfect result ever could. Watch, notice, feel, then try again. Morty imitated him, slowly learning to attune himself to the subtleties of attention, the gentle pulse of discovery. Rick's devices were unusual, not in complexity alone, but in the quiet truths they revealed. One small contraption, no larger than a pencil case, vibrated faintly with what seemed like the heartbeat of a distant dimension. Another hummed with light patterns that shifted imperceptibly when Morty moved a lens or adjusted a wire. These devices were not tools of power. They were instruments of understanding, teaching Rick and Morty to read the soft language of infinity, to interpret the small, delicate messages that flowed between existence and imagination. Even when nothing remarkable appeared to happen, the process itself was profound. Rick would sit back, hands resting on the edge of the bench, and close his eyes for a few moments, feeling the pulse of all the subtle things happening around him. The universe whispered in infinite ways, and though he could not comprehend every message, he could sense their weight, their pattern, their quiet insistence.
And in listening, truly listening, he discovered a calm unlike any other.
A sense that everything, every flicker, every hum, every breath of possibility was connected, soft and intricate, patient and enduring. Morty noticed the change in Rick, too. The way his usual sharpness softened when he worked on these devices. The way his eyes lingered on the hum of a coil or the shimmer of refracted light. The way his hands moved slowly, deliberately, as if every touch mattered, as if the act of noticing was itself sacred. Morty began to see that genius was not only in creation or destruction or mastery. It was in attention, in patience, in the willingness to watch the world unfold and to respond with care rather than force. Rick paused at one point, looking at a tiny prism he had balanced delicately on a spring. Light split through it in a subtle rainbow, and for a moment the colors seemed to swirl like distant galaxies.
"It's beautiful," he whispered, almost to himself. "Even the smallest slice of reality has entire worlds inside it." Morty watched the colors shift, realizing that Rick wasn't speaking only of the prism.
He was speaking of the universe itself, the infinite possibilities hiding in the corners of existence, the gentle magic that waited patiently to be noticed. The whisper of infinity was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet profoundly moving. Rick felt it in the vibration of a coil, in the soft pulse of a holographic projection, in the minute variations of light reflected from a prism. Each small observation was a dialogue with the cosmos, a conversation without words, a silent acknowledgement of existence. And in that acknowledgement, Rick found the quiet satisfaction he had always sought. Not fame, not understanding, not recognition, but the deep, serene joy of participating in the universe, noticing its rhythm, and responding with care. As the day turned to evening, Rick and Morty sat on the floor, surrounded by devices that hummed and shimmered in soft harmony. Morty leaned back against the wall, exhausted but entranced.
I think I get it," he said, voice low, almost shy. "It's not about, like,
Being the smartest or building the coolest thing.
it's noticing. Really noticing." Rick smiled faintly, the kind of smile that arrived slowly and lingered softly.
Exactly, he said. Everything else is secondary. The universe speaks in whispers. If you can hear it, even just a little, that's enough to change everything. For yourself, for others, for the places you touch.
Even without realizing it, outside the sky darkened.
Faint stars blinking awake in the velvet of night. Rick and Morty didn't look up immediately. They stayed with their machines, their tiny, humming universes. But the stars were present, as they always were, quiet witnesses to the slow, careful unfolding of understanding. And in their presence, Rick felt a comfort he rarely admitted, that the universe, vast and mysterious, was patient. It did not rush him. It did not judge him. It waited quietly for the one who would notice its whispers, and it rewarded those who did. And somewhere, in that hush, Rick allowed himself a rare reflection. He remembered the small universes he had loved as a child, the first portal he had crossed, the subtle music of unnoticed worlds. And now here, in the quiet rhythm of machines humming and light refracting, he realized that these experiences were threads, delicate and interwoven, connecting him to Morty, to the worlds they had yet to explore, to the gentle heroism of simply paying attention. He leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment, feeling the hum of infinity pulse around him. There was no rush.
No urgency. Only presence, only care.
Only the soft, deliberate act of noticing the beauty hidden in the folds of reality. And in that presence, Rick felt something rare, a profound peace. The kind that seeps into the marrow of your bones, the kind that whispers without pressure, that everything, even the smallest act of observation, matters. And Morty, watching quietly from the floor, began to understand too. That heroism was not always loud. That adventure was not always explosive. That sometimes the most important journeys were the ones that happened quietly, in the spaces between words and in the hum of creation, in the act of noticing, in the gentle care extended toward the world and those who inhabit it. And somewhere, beyond the humming machines and softly refracted light, the universe itself seemed to sigh softly, acknowledging the small miracle of awareness, the quiet resonance of attention, and the enduring, gentle joy of two beings learning to notice it, together. Rick had always understood the world through observation, through subtlety, through the careful art of noticing. But with Morty, he began to teach not just the mechanics of invention or the thrill of discovery, but the quiet lessons that often went unnoticed. patience, empathy, and the delicate weight of small acts of care. One afternoon, the two of them wandered into a narrow alley behind Rick's home, a place often ignored by neighbors and passers-by. Rick stopped, pointing to a discarded bird's nest tucked between two bricks. The twigs were brittle, and a few feathers clung desperately to the edges. "See this?" he said softly. Most people wouldn't even notice. But a moment here, a thought there, can mean the difference between something being remembered or forgotten. Life exists in the small corners. Attention itself is an act of love. Morty knelt beside the nest, brushing the broken twigs carefully with his fingers.
I didn't know, he murmured, voice low, reverent. I guess.
"I just walk past things all the time," Rick smiled faintly, almost imperceptibly. "Exactly. But noticing doesn't have to be loud. Doesn't have to make a difference for anyone else. Sometimes noticing is enough. A quiet acknowledgement, a soft act of presence." He picked up a single feather, letting it fall slowly through the air. Morty watched it drift, mesmerized by the delicate motion. "See how it moves? Soft, patient, never rushing. That's the way to approach life. Always attentive, never forced." They continued down the alley, Rick pointing out small wonders, a cracked window catching sunlight like a prism, a forgotten garden sprouting from a crack in the pavement, a cat stretching lazily across the path. Morty began to see not just the objects themselves, but the rhythm of attention Rick encouraged, the subtle ways in which care, even if silent, shaped the world. He began to understand that being present, truly present, was a kind of magic he had never imagined. Later, back in the garage, Rick taught Morty another lesson, this time about patience. They worked on a small device designed to record light patterns from the sky. Morty fumbled with wires, frustration mounting.
I can't get it right,
he exclaimed, shoulders tense, cheeks flushed. Rick didn't scold. He simply leaned back, observing.
Patience, he said softly.
Frustration is just a signal you're rushing. Slow down, listen, watch. Notice what's trying to happen, not what you want it to happen. Morty inhaled slowly, letting Rick's words settle like a soft weight in his chest. He tried again, moving more deliberately, letting the wires guide him instead of forcing them. And when the device finally hummed quietly, capturing the gentle dance of sunlight through the window, he felt something more than accomplishment. He felt understanding. He felt connection. To Rick, to the work, to the quiet universe he had never noticed before. Rick watched, pleased without saying much. "See?" he murmured.
Patience isn't waiting.
Patience is noticing, listening, responding thoughtfully. That's the quiet strength most people overlook. And then there was empathy, perhaps the hardest lesson of all. One evening, Morty brought a small, injured bird to the garage, feathers ruffled and wing bent awkwardly.
His eyes were wide, anxious, heart beating fast. I don't know what to do, he whispered. Rick approached slowly, kneeling beside the trembling creature.
"It's okay," he said, voice low, calm, patient. "You don't have to know everything. You just have to notice.
Pay attention.
Give it care, gently, and let it respond in its own time." They worked quietly together, Morty holding the bird with trembling hands while Rick guided, offering subtle adjustments and soft encouragement. They did not rush. They did not panic. The bird, small and fragile, gradually regained some stability, its tiny heartbeat a rhythm that resonated with the quiet lessons Rick had been teaching. Patience,
presence, and the gentle power of empathy. Morty's eyes filled with a mixture of relief and wonder. I think I understand a little now, he said softly.
It's not just about fixing things.
It's about caring, Rick nodded. Exactly. Care isn't loud.
It doesn't demand recognition, but it matters more than most things people chase. In the following weeks, the lessons took root in ways neither of them could fully articulate. Morty began to notice the soft details around him, The subtle tremor in a tree branch in the wind, the gentle curve of a puddle catching the sky, the quiet weight of a friend's hesitation before a word is spoken. Rick, observing him, felt a faint, steady warmth, a sense that these teachings were not just shaping Morty, but reshaping him as well. He discovered again that heroism could exist in subtlety, in small attentions, in the quiet affirmation of another being's presence. Even ordinary days carried extraordinary meaning. They would sit on the porch in the late afternoon, watching the world soften into twilight. Rick would hum faintly, a tune that seemed to drift with the evening breeze, and Morty would hum back, sometimes perfectly, sometimes slightly off, but always with intent and awareness. These small harmonies, so easily overlooked, became rituals of presence, a gentle echo of the lessons Rick had carried since childhood and through the universes he had discovered. On one such evening, Morty asked a question quiet but significant. "Rick,
Do you ever get lonely? Even when you're noticing everything?"
Rick paused, eyes tracing the golden threads of sunlight fading from the horizon. "Sometimes," he admitted softly. "But noticing, truly noticing, reminds you that you are never alone. Everything has a pulse, a rhythm, a presence. And if you listen, you'll find companions everywhere. Sometimes they look like birds, sometimes like machines, sometimes like people. The trick is to see them, to care for them, to acknowledge them. That's what keeps loneliness from taking root." Morty considered this, watching a small firefly drift lazily across the garden.
"So, noticing and caring, that's kind of like magic?"
Rick chuckled softly, a sound more like a sigh than laughter. "Yes, a quiet magic.
One that doesn't shout.
One that lasts longer than any explosion or flashy display. It's invisible until you see it. And once you see it, it stays with you." The stars began to blink awake above them, faint pinpricks of light against the deepening indigo sky. Rick and Morty sat in silence, letting the lessons of the day settle into their bones. Patience, empathy, attention, care. These were not rules or duties, but rhythms, ways of moving through the world with quiet awareness, ways of planting small seeds that would ripple gently into infinite spaces. And as the night deepened, Rick thought of all the universes he had wandered alone, all the moments he had noticed in solitude, and he realized that these lessons, these soft, deliberate attentions, were the most profound discoveries he had ever made. Not portals, not devices, not clever inventions, but the slow, quiet cultivation of understanding and care, extended outward to another soul, a companion in noticing, a fellow traveler through infinity. Morty leaned against him lightly, tired, calm, and Rick allowed the small, rare warmth of closeness to settle without comment. It was not dramatic, not loud, not celebrated. It simply existed. And in that existence, both of them felt, in ways words could not fully capture, the quiet power of presence, the enduring magic of empathy, and the infinite, gentle joy of noticing together. And somewhere, beneath the soft shimmer of stars and the slow hum of evening life, Rick thought, perhaps these small, unnoticed moments, it was the real adventure. The adventure of paying attention, of caring without demand, of shaping life gently with awareness and love. And he allowed himself, for the first time in a long while, to feel the soft exhale of contentment that comes from living fully, quietly, and deliberately in the world. The first adventure Rick and Morty embarked upon together was not loud, not explosive, not dramatic in any conventional sense. It began quietly, with the soft hum of a portal device and the faint curl of light that always seemed to welcome Rick wherever he went. Morty hovered nearby, hesitant but trusting, holding the small satchel Rick had insisted he bring. He was not prepared for danger or excitement. He was prepared, as Rick had quietly taught him, to notice. Rick adjusted the portal, his hands moving slowly, deliberately. "Today," he said softly, "we're going somewhere subtle, Somewhere you can learn without the chaos overwhelming you. Morty nodded, shoulders tight with nervous anticipation. He trusted Rick, and that trust carried him forward through the portal's gentle shimmer, into a world that seemed less like a destination and more like a carefully folded dream. They stepped out onto a field bathed in a soft golden light, the kind that lingered at dawn or twilight when the world itself seemed to pause. The grass swayed in slow, rhythmic waves, and the air smelled faintly of rain and honey. Rick exhaled, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth.
Notice it, he whispered, voice low.
Every sound, every movement, every color. Let the world speak to you, Morty. That's the adventure. Morty took a hesitant step forward, feeling the softness of the grass beneath his shoes, the gentle vibration of the earth beneath him. He looked up at the sky, where clouds drifted lazily in slow, spiraling currents.
It's kind of amazing, he murmured. I've never seen anything like this. Rick nodded, watching him with a quiet satisfaction.
Most people don't. They walk through the world with their eyes half closed. But noticing, truly noticing, is the first step toward understanding. It's the first step toward caring. They wandered slowly, allowing the field to guide their movements rather than the other way around. Small creatures, almost imperceptible, scuttled through the grass, their tiny bodies catching the light in delicate patterns. Morty leaned down to watch one, noticing the careful rhythm of its steps, the subtle way it responded to the wind, the faint hum it seemed to produce as it moved. Rick crouched beside him, pointing quietly to another creature, then another, each one a soft lesson in observation. This world, Rick said softly, teaches you patience. It teaches you empathy. And it teaches you that sometimes the smallest things matter more than the largest gestures. Morty absorbed the words slowly, letting them settle around him like a gentle fog. He realized that this was what Rick meant by adventure, not battles, not explosions, not daring feats, but the slow, deliberate act of noticing, understanding, and caring. They came to a small pond, its surface perfectly still, reflecting the light of the sky above. Rick knelt beside it, tracing a finger through the water, creating faint ripples that radiated outward. Even small movements create echoes, he said softly. A ripple here can change something over there.
Everything is connected.
And if you're paying attention, you can see those connections, even the subtle ones. Morty dipped his hand into the water, letting the cool liquid flow over his fingers. He watched the ripples spread, carrying reflections of the clouds, the light, and the distant trees. It was beautiful in a way that made his chest ache softly, a quiet, deep joy that he had never felt before. And he understood, in that moment, the subtle power of observation, the gentle magic of noticing. Rick watched him with a quiet pride, though he did not speak it aloud. He understood, perhaps more than he ever had before, that heroism was not always loud. It was not always grand. Sometimes it existed in soft awareness, in careful attention, in the willingness to notice and care without demand. And in Morty, he saw the beginnings of that quiet heroism. They moved on, exploring small hills and meandering paths that seemed almost designed to teach subtle lessons. Rick pointed out patterns in the light, in the way shadows stretched across the grass, in the delicate spirals of flowers and leaves. Morty learned to follow his observations with patience, to let his curiosity guide him without rushing, to respond to the world with gentle care rather than force. At one point, a small bird landed nearby, its feathers shimmering in shades of silver and lavender. Morty froze, eyes wide, hands trembling slightly. Rick crouched beside him, whispering, "Don't move too fast. Let it decide whether it wants to stay or leave."
That's empathy, Morty. Not acting for yourself,
but observing and respecting the choice of another. Morty exhaled slowly, letting the bird settle for a few moments before it took off again. wings catching the golden light as it disappeared into the distance. They continued through the field until evening approached, the sky painted in soft shades of pink and indigo. Rick and Morty sat on a gentle rise, watching the light fade. The field hummed quietly around them, alive with invisible rhythms, small creatures moving in their subtle ways, and the soft pulse of life everywhere. Morty leaned back, exhausted but calm, feeling the weight of lessons settling gently into his mind and heart. Rick broke the silence, voice soft. "Today, Morty, you learn more than I could have taught in words. You learned to notice. You learned patience. You learned empathy. And in that, you've taken the first real steps on your adventure. The kind of adventure that matters." Morty smiled faintly, his eyes reflecting the last of the sunlight.
I think I understand.
Maybe I don't get everything yet, but I feel it.
I feel like I'm starting to see things. Rick nodded, letting the words hang between them.
The adventure had been quiet, almost imperceptible in its unfolding, yet profound in its effect. They had not fought monsters. They had not travelled to dangerous planets. They had not tested their courage in the usual ways. Instead, they had learned to move through the world with awareness, to notice its small wonders, and to recognize the quiet power of attention and care. As night fell, Rick and Morty returned to the portal. It shimmered softly, a gentle circle of light waiting to carry them home. Morty glanced back at the field one last time, noticing the way the shadows stretched, the faint flicker of a firefly, the gentle rustle of the wind through the grass. He realized that the adventure did not end with the portal, that the lessons he had learned would linger, quietly shaping the way he noticed and cared in the world he would return to. Rick stepped through first, then Morty, and the portal closed behind them with a faint sigh. The garage was dim, the machines humming softly in the background, familiar and grounding. And in that familiar hum, both of them felt the echo of the gentle adventure they had shared, a quiet joy that settled into their bones, a soft understanding that the smallest acts of awareness could carry more significance than the loudest feats of heroism. Rick glanced at Morty, eyes soft. "Remember, Morty," he said, almost a whisper, "the universe is full of small wonders. You just have to notice them. That's the real adventure." Morty nodded, closing his eyes briefly, feeling the hum of the machines and the quiet rhythm of their shared presence.
"I will, Rick," he whispered.
"I think I finally understand." And somewhere, beyond the walls of the garage and the shimmer of familiar machines, the universe itself seemed to exhale softly, acknowledging the small miracle of noticing, the quiet power of empathy, and the gentle joy of two beings learning to move carefully, patiently, and lovingly through the infinite possibilities of existence. The next adventure began not with urgency, but with a gentle ripple in Rick's portal device, the soft curl of light reminding them that even the most subtle movements could carry them somewhere new. Morty stood beside Rick, hands tucked nervously in his pockets, heart beating quietly in anticipation. There was no explosion, no blaring alarm, only the quiet hum of possibility, the faint whisper of worlds waiting to be noticed. Rick adjusted the dials, eyes focused but calm, as he prepared the portal. "This one's different," he murmured. "It's a universe that doesn't shout. It doesn't call attention to itself. You'll have to listen for it, Morty. Notice the small things." "That's how it speaks," Morty swallowed, taking a tentative step forward.
Rick, how do you listen for a universe?"
Rick gave a soft smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes, yet carried a warmth Morty rarely saw. "You observe. You pay attention. You allow yourself to notice without rushing.
And you don't try to understand it all at once, you just
feel it." The portal shimmered and pulsed gently, and then they stepped through, the familiar sensation of being carried across dimensions wrapping around them like a soft blanket. When they arrived, the world was unlike any they had seen before. Colors were muted, slightly out of focus, as if the universe itself were viewing the world through a lens of gentle abstraction. Trees bent softly toward the light. Rivers curved in lazy spirals. Even the wind carried a faint, melodic hum, like the memory of a song half forgotten. Morty blinked, trying to make sense of it.
It looks blurry.
Like everything's kind of
Soft. Rick crouched beside him, scanning the horizon. Exactly. That's why I brought you here.
This universe doesn't reward force or urgency. It rewards attention, patience, and subtle observation. You'll have to notice the details that most people overlook. That's where its lessons live. They wandered slowly through the landscape, moving with deliberate care. Morty noticed patterns he would never have seen in his own world. The gentle sway of grass blades responding to invisible currents, the quiet rhythm of clouds that spiraled like dancers across the sky, the soft shimmer of light reflecting off the water's surface in unpredictable ways. Rick walked beside him, pointing to details without commanding attention, allowing Morty to discover them in his own time.
Every place has its own rhythm, Rick whispered.
Some are loud, some are quiet. Some shout their lessons. Some whisper them. This one whispers. You have to slow down and listen, Morty nodded, focusing intently. He noticed a small creature, almost transparent, scuttling along a stone path. Its movements were so delicate that Morty almost missed it, but Rick nudged him gently, just enough to draw attention without forcing it. Morty crouched to observe, mesmerized by its slow, intricate dance.
It's beautiful, he breathed. I almost didn't see it. Rick allowed a small smile, satisfied.
That's the universe rewarding attention. Not with applause, not with fireworks, but with subtle recognition. You saw what others would pass by. And that's enough, they continued, encountering streams that curved in impossible patterns and trees whose leaves hummed softly when touched. Morty learned to move carefully, to anticipate, to let the world unfold before him without trying to force understanding. Every step, every observation became a lesson in patience and awareness. The universe responded to their quiet presence, revealing its mysteries only when they approached with gentleness. At one point, a gentle rain began to fall, each drop shimmering slightly as if catching fragments of hidden light. Morty lifted his hands, letting the rain settle on his palms, marveling at its delicate weight.
It's like
the rain knows we're listening, he murmured. Rick chuckled softly, a sound like a sigh.
Not knowing, Morty, that's part of it. You don't have to understand everything.
Just notice, just respond, just care.
That's what matters. They found a small hill and sat, watching the muted sunset ripple across the sky.
The colors were soft, pastel, almost dreamlike, blending together in ways that defied the logic Morty was used to. Yet he didn't feel confused. He felt calm, attentive, connected. He felt the universe speaking in subtle waves, and he felt, for the first time, that he could hear it. Rick leaned back, eyes on the horizon. Some universes are like mirrors, Morty. They reflect back what you carry inside. Notice them carefully, and you'll learn something about yourself along the way. Morty followed his gaze, thinking quietly. He realized that the gentle focus required here was teaching him more than any loud adventure could. The patience to observe, the empathy to respect the world's pace, the awareness to notice the smallest wonders. These were lessons he could carry anywhere, lessons that would shape him long after the portal closed. As darkness fell, they came upon a small pond. Its surface was perfectly still, reflecting the distorted sky in soft, swirling patterns. Morty leaned forward, fascinated, noticing faint ripples that seemed to respond to the light of the stars. Rick crouched beside him, pointing quietly to a subtle shimmer near the water's edge. "Everything communicates, Morty," he said softly. "Even things that seem ordinary, even things that are out of focus. You just have to notice and sometimes respond gently."
That's how you honor the world around you. Morty extended a finger to touch the water, sending a ripple through the reflected stars.
He smiled, a quiet, reflective smile. I think
I'm starting to understand. It's not about doing big things. It's about noticing, being present.
and letting the universe respond. Rick nodded, eyes soft. Exactly. This is the adventure that matters most. The quiet adventure. The one that doesn't need explosions or heroics. Just attention. Just care. They lingered until the first faint glimmers of night shimmered across the muted sky, the gentle pulse of the universe echoing around them. Morty leaned back against Rick, tired but calm, absorbing the rhythm of this world in a way that words could not capture. He felt the soft bond between them deepen, a bond of shared attention, of quiet observation, of patience and care. When they finally returned through the portal, the garage hummed around them, familiar and grounding. Morty blinked, adjusting to the world he had known, yet carrying with him the lessons of the soft focus universe. Rick watched him, noticing the subtle change in posture, the quiet attentiveness that lingered even after the adventure ended. Rick spoke softly,
almost to himself. Every universe has a lesson, Morty. Some shout,
some whisper. The ones that whisper, those are the ones that stay with you. Morty nodded, closing his eyes briefly, feeling the gentle hum of the garage and the soft pulse of understanding within him. He realized that the universe was not just something outside him, but something he could carry, quietly, attentively,
lovingly, wherever he went, and somewhere.
Beyond the shimmer of the portal and the low hum of machines, the universe itself seemed to sigh gently, acknowledging the small miracle of two beings learning to move carefully, deliberately and compassionately through worlds, noticing, listening, and quietly growing together. The next morning, Rick led Morty to a new portal, one that hummed softer than usual, its light curling like a lazy ribbon in the air. Morty hesitated, watching the faint shimmer, but Rick's quiet gaze reassured him. This one's
delicate, Rick said softly.
You'll need to move carefully, Morty. Pay attention. Feel it. Let it teach you. Morty swallowed and nodded, feeling the pulse of anticipation. Not excitement, not fear, just that quiet awareness Rick had been cultivating in him. They stepped through together, the familiar soft sensation of transition wrapping around them like a slow, gentle sigh. On the other side, they emerged in a place that seemed to exist between memory and dream. It was a garden, but unlike any garden Morty had ever seen. Trees twisted gently toward the sky, their branches bending as if listening. Flowers shimmered in colors that were hard to name, petals moving slowly in rhythms that felt like breath. Light filtered in soft waves, casting gentle shadows that shifted imperceptibly. Rick knelt beside a small stone path, letting his fingers trace the grooves worn into the surface. Notice the echoes here, Morty? He whispered. This garden remembers.
Every step you take, every touch you give, every thought you carry leaves a trace. That's why we move softly here.
The garden responds to presence, not force. Morty stepped forward, feeling the weight of each footfall. The soil was soft beneath his shoes, the grass brushing his ankles like a whisper. He looked around, eyes wide, noticing details that seemed almost alive, a leaf that trembled in response to the breeze, a small butterfly hovering with careful precision. The way sunlight split through branches in delicate streams. This place, it's alive, he murmured.
But it's quiet. I don't hear anything like usual. Rick smiled faintly, a ghost of warmth.
That's because it speaks in subtleties, Morty. You don't need ears to listen. You need attention. You need care.
And you need patience. They wandered deeper into the garden, moving along winding paths that seemed to lead nowhere and everywhere at once.
Morty noticed reflections in puddles that didn't quite match the sky, shadows that lingered slightly longer than they should, flowers that seemed to lean toward him when he looked. Each observation carried a subtle lesson. Presence mattered. Small actions mattered. Awareness itself was a kind of magic. At the center of the garden, they came upon a fountain carved from stone, water spilling in slow, deliberate arcs. Morty knelt beside it, watching the ripples distort the reflection of trees and sky.
Everything here reacts, he whispered.
Even the water. Rick crouched beside him, fingers hovering just above the surface. Exactly. Every action, no matter how small, creates echoes. That's why you move carefully here.
And why you notice?
That's the lesson. Morty dipped a finger into the water, sending faint ripples outward. The fountain seemed to shimmer in response, as if acknowledging the gentle touch. Morty's chest lifted slightly with quiet wonder. He realized, slowly, that this universe, like the others Rick had introduced him to, was teaching him something essential, that attention. Patience and empathy were more powerful than any invention. Any portal, any dramatic feat. Rick leaned back, observing him quietly. Most people never notice the echoes of their actions, Morty. They walk through the world as though it doesn't respond, as though nothing matters. But every living thing, every particle, every subtle motion, it carries meaning. And if you pay attention, you can learn more than from any fight, any chase, any loud adventure. Morty nodded, absorbing the lesson in a calm, reflective silence. He followed Rick along a narrow path lined with blossoms that leaned toward them, as if to acknowledge their careful passage. He realized that noticing was not passive. It was active. It was deliberate. It was gentle heroism. Suddenly a soft breeze stirred the garden, carrying the faint hum of whispers, so quiet that Morty almost missed it.
Do you hear that?
He asked softly. Rick closed his eyes, listening. The garden is speaking, he whispered back. Not in words, not in sounds you'd usually notice, but it's aware of you.
Of me, of us.
And it responds accordingly.
That's why we respect it. That's why we move slowly.
That's why we observe. Morty tilted his head, letting the hum of whispers wash over him. He realized it was not a sound to be understood, but a feeling to be felt. A vibration of life, a trace of presence, a gentle acknowledgement of existence. And in that hum, he felt a profound connection, a sense of quiet companionship with a world that seemed almost alive in ways he had never imagined. They continued through the garden until the shadows deepened, the sky above glowing faintly with soft, muted colors. Rick paused near a small archway of intertwined branches. Sometimes, he said softly, you'll come across challenges in the world that aren't loud, that aren't obvious. They'll test your patience, your empathy, your attention.
This garden
is one of those tests. Not to punish you, Morty, but to help you grow. Morty followed him carefully, noticing the subtle changes in the air, the faint shift in the hum of whispers, the slight tremor of leaves as they passed. Every step required awareness, every gesture carried weight, every observation demanded care. And he realized that the challenge was not danger, but presence, the willingness to move gently, to notice fully, to respond thoughtfully. As night approached, they reached a clearing where a single, enormous tree stood, its branches extending like arms toward the sky. Morty felt a pulse emanating from it, a rhythm that resonated deep in his chest.
It's breathing, he whispered.
Or maybe it's me, Rick nodded, placing a hand on the rough bark. The garden reflects you, Morty. Your attention, your care, your presence. That's the subtle challenge. You learn about the world by learning about yourself. And you learn about yourself by moving with awareness, by noticing the echoes you leave behind. Morty knelt beside the tree, placing his hands gently on the roots. He closed his eyes, letting the rhythm of the garden merge with the rhythm of his own heartbeat. He felt the lessons of the universe settling into him. Patience, empathy, presence, attention. He felt the quiet strength of understanding, the soft heroism of caring without demand, and the subtle magic of noticing. Rick watched him, silently acknowledging the growth he had observed. There was no applause, no fanfare, no dramatic gesture. Only the quiet hum of the garden, the faint shimmer of twilight, and the gentle bond of two beings learning, slowly, carefully, and together. As they stepped back toward the portal, the garden seemed to exhale softly, acknowledging their careful passage, their presence, and the echoes they had left behind. Morty glanced back one last time, noticing the subtle shimmer of leaves, the gentle sway of branches, the faint hum that lingered in the air. When they returned to the garage, Morty felt different. Not louder, not braver, not faster, but quieter, more aware, more patient, more attuned to the delicate pulse of the world around him. And Rick, observing him, felt a rare warmth, a sense that the lessons of quiet heroism, subtle attention, and gentle empathy were taking root in the mind and heart of the boy who followed him through dimensions. Rick spoke softly, almost a whisper, as they settled into the hum of the familiar garage. Remember, Morty, not all challenges are loud. Not all tests are obvious. Some of the most important ones are quiet. And if you notice, if you care, if you respond, you'll learn more than most people ever do. Morty nodded, closing his eyes briefly. He could still feel the pulse of the garden in his chest, the echoes of the whispers, the soft rhythm of leaves and branches and light. And somewhere deep inside he understood, fully, that this quiet attention, this subtle care, was the true adventure, the one that lasted, the one that mattered, the one that could shape him softly. For the rest of his life, after returning from the Garden of Echoes, Morty found himself seeing his own world differently, though he didn't realize it at first. The garage hummed with familiar sounds, the soft vibration of machines, the faint whir of Rick's portal devices, but they no longer felt mundane. Each sound carried subtle rhythms, each shadow held quiet meaning. Each faint glow seemed to pulse in gentle conversation with the space around them. Rick sat at his workbench, tinkering with a small device, hands moving slowly, deliberately. "You notice it, Morty?" he asked, without looking up. "Even here, in the ordinary, there's a pulse, a rhythm, a tiny universe in every corner."
Most people walk past it, but
You're starting to notice, Morty nodded, hesitating.
I think I see it differently now.
It's not just the portals or the other worlds.
It's everything.
Even the garage feels alive. Rick finally looked up, a faint smile brushing his lips. Exactly.
That's what I've been trying to show you.
Not the flashy stuff. Not the loud adventures. The real magic is in noticing, in responding, in care. They spent the morning moving quietly through the house, observing small details that Morty had never paid attention to before. A sunbeam falling across the kitchen table, illuminating dust motes in soft gold. The gentle sway of a plant near the window, leaves moving almost imperceptibly. The way a stack of tools on Rick's workbench cast long, quiet shadows. Morty absorbed it all, letting it settle around him like a soft cloak. Lunch came quietly. Morty made sandwiches, noticing the way the bread felt soft beneath his fingers, the faint aroma of mustard and cheese filling the air. Rick sat across from him, watching without comment, letting Morty move at his own pace. Morty felt a small joy in the act, simple, ordinary, yet filled with a subtle connection. He realized that even mundane acts could carry meaning if approached with awareness. After lunch, they sat in the living room, the soft light of the afternoon streaming through the windows. Morty noticed the way the shadows shifted slowly, the quiet rhythm of dust motes drifting in the beams, the faint hum of distant city life outside. He could feel the pulse of attention settling into his bones, the lessons of patience and observation echoing softly within him. Rick broke the silence with a quiet question. "Morty, but do you remember the Garden of Echoes?" Morty nodded.
Yeah, I can still feel it.
The hum, the subtle pulses, the way it responded to us. Rick leaned back, eyes soft. "Good. because that garden isn't just a place. It's a lesson.
And the lesson lives wherever you go.
Even here, even now. Everything reacts to your presence, your attention, your care, and that's something you can carry with you. Quietly, every day, Morty considered this, thinking about the small moments he had noticed in the garage, the sunbeam on the kitchen table, the sway of the plants.
So, noticing and caring.
That's the adventure, even at home? He asked softly. Rick nodded, a faint gleam in his eyes. Exactly. Adventures aren't just about traveling to strange worlds or fighting monsters. The real adventures are the ones where you see, where you notice, where you respond with patience and empathy. That's heroism, Morty. Quiet heroism. The afternoon passed in a soft rhythm of observation and reflection. Morty moved carefully through the house, noticing subtle details he had never appreciated before. The faint pattern of light on the wall, the way a chair creaked slightly as it settled into the floor, the quiet rustle of leaves outside. Each small observation felt like a small victory, a subtle affirmation of the lessons Rick had been teaching. Later, Rick suggested they go outside into the backyard, where the soft wind moved gently through the trees. Morty walked slowly, paying attention to the way the grass bent beneath his feet, the way shadows shifted as clouds passed overhead, the faint scent of earth and flowers carried on the breeze. It was a simple act, yet profound in its effect. Morty felt grounded, connected, aware. Rick watched him quietly. Most people never slow down enough to notice these things, Morty. They rush through life, missing the subtleties, the patterns, the quiet echoes. But you're learning to listen, to feel, to observe. And that's something rare. Morty paused near a small patch of wildflowers, noticing the way each blossom seemed to reach for the light in its own way. It's kind of like the garden of echoes, he murmured. Everything responds to how you approach it, even small things.
Even flowers, Rick nodded.
Exactly. The universe is full of soft lessons, Morty. You just have to notice, pay attention, and care. As evening approached, they returned inside, the gentle hum of the house welcoming them back. Morty felt a quiet sense of fulfillment, not from dramatic events or exciting discoveries, but from the soft, attentive observation of the world around him. He realized that the lessons of patience, empathy, and careful attention could be applied anywhere, in every corner of life, in every quiet moment, in every interaction. That night, Morty lay in bed thinking about the day. He could still feel the pulse of the garden of echoes, the hum of subtle universes, the quiet rhythm of his own home. He realized that learning to notice, to respond gently and to care without expectation was an adventure that never ended. It was a journey inward as much as outward, a slow cultivation of understanding and presence that would ripple into everything he did. Rick came in briefly to check on him, not speaking, only watching quietly for a moment. Morty noticed the faint shadow of concern, of pride, and of quiet affection in Rick's eyes. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet it carried a profound weight. Morty felt it settle around him like a soft blanket, a quiet affirmation that he was learning, growing, becoming more attuned to the world around him. Rick finally spoke, softly, almost a whisper. Remember, Morty, the quiet moments, the small acts of attention and care, they matter more than anything else. Not because they're dramatic, but because they ripple outward.
And those ripples?
They can last a long time, Morty nodded, eyes closing, letting the lessons of the day settle into his mind and heart. He felt a deep sense of peace, a calm awareness of the world around him, and a gentle understanding that even the smallest acts could carry immense meaning. Outside, the night moved softly through the trees, a quiet symphony of wind and shadow and subtle life. Morty could feel it all resonating gently within him. He understood, finally, that true adventure was not always loud. It was not always visible. It was quiet, patient, observant, and empathetic. And it was everywhere, even at home, even in the ordinary, even in the small, unnoticed corners of life, and somewhere, in the soft hum of machines, the quiet rhythm of the house, and the gentle pulse of life all around, Morty felt the steady truth of Rick's words. Attention and care were the most powerful adventures of all, and he was beginning to understand how to live them fully. The next morning, Morty woke with a gentle awareness humming in his chest, the soft rhythm of the garden of echoes still lingering. Even the simple act of opening his eyes felt profound. The sunlight filtered in through the blinds, casting delicate patterns across the floor. Dust motes swirled lazily in the light, each tiny particle a miniature universe in motion. Morty noticed it all quietly, without urgency. Rick was already in the garage, tinkering with a small device that emitted soft, pulsing light. "Good morning, Morty," he said, voice calm, almost reverent. "Ready to see how the universe carries echoes beyond your little home?" Morty nodded, feeling a subtle excitement, a quiet anticipation that wasn't frantic or anxious. He understood now that adventure did not need to scream. It could be gentle, observant, patient, and still transform the way he perceived everything. They stepped through the portal, and the world on the other side welcomed them with a soft, ambient glow. This universe was unlike the ones they had visited before. It was vast, infinite in feeling, yet intimate in detail. Stars stretched across the sky in delicate patterns, almost as if someone had painted them with trembling hands. Planets rotated slowly, their surfaces reflecting faint, unearthly light. The cosmos itself seemed to breathe, each movement subtle but purposeful. Morty paused, eyes wide, taking in the gentle magnificence.
"It's huge," he whispered, voice barely above the soft hum of the universe.
"But it feels
Calm, like it's
waiting for us to notice." Rick nodded, crouching to observe a small patch of floating cosmic dust. "Exactly.
That's the lesson here.
The universe carries patterns, Morty. Not just in stars or planets, but in motion, in light, in time itself.
And these patterns,
They speak to those who notice. They reward patience and awareness. They began to move slowly, drifting between celestial currents, observing the quiet flow of energy. Morty noticed subtle shifts in the glow of a nearby nebula, the way starlight bent softly around an unseen planet, the rhythm of small asteroids drifting through gravity in a gentle dance. Each detail seemed connected to another, as if the universe itself were composing a quiet symphony. Rick pointed to a faint spiral of starlight.
"See that, Morty?
Most people fly past it, don't even see it.
But it exists. It always exists.
And if you take the time to notice, it teaches you something. That's the quiet power of the cosmos." Morty leaned closer, letting the faint pulse of light wash over his skin, almost like a whisper against his consciousness. "It's
Beautiful," he murmured. "And
It feels like it's alive." Rick smiled faintly, a rare softness in his gaze. "In a way it is. Everything reacts to presence, Morty, even stars,
even light."
and the more you notice, the more you understand your place in it all. Not as a hero with weapons or gadgets, but as someone who observes, responds, and cares. As they drifted further, Morty began to see patterns he hadn't noticed at first. Stars moved in tiny, almost imperceptible waves. Cosmic dust spiraled in slow arcs, forming shapes that repeated themselves across distances. The light of distant suns bent around hidden planets, forming arcs that echoed in other constellations. Morty realized that the universe was not chaotic. It was subtle, delicate, intentional, and it was communicating through patterns that rewarded quiet attention. Rick floated nearby, observing Morty with a calm intensity. "Most people see randomness, Morty, chaos, but it's not. The patterns are there. They're always there, and if you pay attention, you can see the stories they tell." Morty tilted his head, absorbing the lesson. He focused on the small arcs of light, tracing their movement with his gaze, noticing how one subtle shift here created a ripple elsewhere. The universe began to feel like a living organism, breathing and pulsing in a rhythm that only patience and observation could reveal. This
is like the Garden of Echoes, Morty said softly.
Everything reacts, everything communicates, even things that seem far away.
Even stars, Rick nodded, eyes glinting with approval. Exactly.
You've got it, Morty. Patterns exist everywhere, in the smallest leaf, in the hum of a machine, in the cosmos itself. They respond to attention. They respond to care. And they teach those who are willing to see them. As they drifted, Morty began to understand something deeper. The universe was not just teaching him about observation or patience. It was teaching him about connection. Every star, every planet, every particle, every faint pulse of light, they were all connected. And he, Morty, was connected to them, not as a manipulator, not as a conqueror, but as a participant, a quiet observer, a gentle presence. They came upon a faint spiral of light stretching across the void like an enormous cosmic echo. Morty followed it with his eyes, tracing its delicate curves, noticing the subtle variations in intensity and rhythm.
It's like it's alive, he whispered.
Like it's breathing. Rick floated beside him, voice calm and reverent. It is, Morty. In its own way, every star, every planet, every particle breathes. And the more you notice, the more you become part of its rhythm.
That's the quiet heroism we've been practicing.
Not loud, not dramatic, but real. And lasting. Morty leaned back, letting the gentle pulse of the universe wash over him. He felt a soft joy, a quiet awe, a subtle sense of belonging he had never felt before. For the first time, he understood that adventure was not about danger or heroics. It was about noticing, observing, understanding, and quietly participating in the rhythms of the world and the cosmos around him. They drifted for hours, moving gently through constellations and nebulae, observing patterns, tracing subtle arcs of light, and noting the quiet echoes that rippled outward from every presence. Morty felt his awareness expanding, not in a frantic, overwhelming way, but in a calm, meditative rhythm, each new observation building softly upon the last. Rick finally spoke, voice low and contemplative. Morty, remember this. Everything is connected. Your actions, your observations, your care, even your quiet attention. They ripple outward. Not with explosions, not with drama, but with subtle echoes that can last far longer than you imagine. Morty nodded, feeling the lesson settle deep in his chest. He realized that the universe itself, vast and infinite, responded to the gentleness of observation, the patience of care, and the quiet persistence of attention. And he understood that he could carry this lesson everywhere, not just in strange, distant worlds, but in his home, in his daily life, in every small interaction. As the portal hummed softly in the distance, signaling it was time to return, Morty glanced one last time at the faint spiral of cosmic light. He felt a deep, reflective peace, a quiet joy, and an understanding that he was learning the kind of heroism that mattered most, the quiet, observant, empathetic,
patient kind. Rick glanced at him, eyes soft, approving.
Good work today, Morty. The cosmos can be loud, flashy, chaotic, but the real lessons live in the quiet patterns, in the soft echoes, in the things that respond to care. Remember that? Morty nodded, feeling the pulse of the universe linger in him as they returned through the portal. Back in the garage, the machines hummed familiar rhythms, shadows stretched softly across walls, and the faint golden light of late afternoon filtered in. But Morty saw it differently now. He noticed patterns, echoes, rhythms, and he understood quietly that he was part of them, and somewhere in the soft hum of the machines, the gentle rhythm of the garage, and the quiet pulse of the wider universe, Morty felt the steady truth. noticing, caring, observing, and responding gently were the greatest adventures of all, and they were always available to those who truly chose to see. The morning was calm, with sunlight spilling lazily across the garage floor. Morty moved slowly, almost reverently, noticing the way the light kissed the edges of workbenches, the soft hum of machines, the gentle sway of a hanging cord in the corner. Each tiny detail seemed alive, vibrating with a quiet rhythm he had begun to understand, a rhythm that carried far more meaning than he could have imagined. Rick was tinkering with a small, intricate device, eyes focused, but he allowed Morty to move alongside him without interruption. "You've been noticing, Morty," Rick said softly, almost without looking up.
Not just the big stuff.
"The subtle stuff."
That's important.
"More important than you realize." Morty paused, hands resting lightly on the edge of the workbench.
I think I'm starting to understand. Even small actions, even quiet things.
"They can matter, right?" Rick nodded, his expression softening.
Exactly.
"And that's where empathy comes in, Morty. It's the quiet understanding of how the world reacts to you and how you respond to it. It's noticing, caring, and acting with awareness. That's the quiet heroism you've been learning." They stepped outside, the soft wind carrying scents of grass and flowers, of distant streets and the gentle hum of life beyond the garage. Morty moved with deliberate care, observing small patterns in the way leaves shifted, in the faint movements of birds, even in the subtle changes in Rick's posture. He realized that observation was not passive. It was an act of connection. As they walked through the backyard, Morty noticed Summer sitting quietly on the porch, her sketchbook balanced on her knees. Her brow was furrowed in concentration, but her pencil moved with gentle precision, capturing lines and shapes in a soft, meditative rhythm. Morty paused, almost forgetting to breathe, noticing the care in her movements, the patience in her focus. Rick noticed him looking and said quietly, "See, Morty? Empathy isn't just noticing the world around you, it's noticing the people in it.
Understanding them without needing to interrupt or fix anything. Just
Observing and respecting their rhythm." Morty took a cautious step closer.
I get it. She's focused. And if I just respect that, I'm already helping.
Rick gave a faint nod.
Exactly. You don't have to do anything dramatic.
Just being aware, being present, being gentle.
That's enough.
Sometimes the smallest gestures matter more than grand actions. Morty smiled softly, feeling a warmth spread through him. He approached Summer slowly, not speaking, just sitting on the edge of the porch, hands resting lightly on his knees. Summer glanced at him briefly, then returned to her sketching. Morty didn't feel the need to force conversation. He simply watched, noticing her calm focus, feeling a quiet connection that didn't require words. After a few minutes, Summer looked up fully, smiling faintly.
"Hey, Morty," she said softly.
"You're quiet today," Morty nodded, his voice gentle. "I'm
Noticing. Just paying attention."
Summer tilted her head, considering him for a moment. "I like that," she said, returning her gaze to the sketchbook. Morty felt a subtle satisfaction, realizing that even small gestures of empathy and attention could ripple outward, creating moments of understanding and connection without words or urgency. Later, Rick led Morty to a small hill behind the house. The grass was soft underfoot, and the trees swayed gently in the wind. Rick pointed quietly to the horizon, where faint clouds curled in slow, deliberate patterns. "Morty, empathy is like this hill," he said softly. "It's not about climbing to the top quickly, not about rushing. It's about moving carefully, noticing every step, feeling the weight of each action, understanding the subtle changes in the world around you." Morty nodded, feeling the rhythm of the earth beneath him, the soft pulse of life all around, and the subtle echo of Rick's words.
It's not always about doing something big, is it?
Rick shook his head gently.
No, Morty, big actions can be impressive.
but the quiet ripples of care, observation, and understanding, those last longer. They touch people and places in ways most people never notice.
And sometimes
They're the most important actions of all. Morty moved down the hill slowly, letting the grass brush against his legs, observing the faint ripples of wind in the trees, noticing the distant hum of city life. He felt connected not only to the physical world, but to the emotional currents flowing through it. He realized that the quiet heroism he had been learning was not just about observation. It was about emotional awareness, understanding, and subtle connection. As they returned to the garage, Morty noticed Jerry sitting in the corner, fiddling with a half-assembled gadget. His brow was furrowed, his hands moving hesitantly, unsure of each step. Morty paused, observing without judgment, just noticing the quiet struggle. He felt a subtle tug in his chest, a quiet urge to respond with care rather than correction. He walked over, gently placing a hand on Jerry's shoulder.
"Hey, want me to help?"
he asked softly. Jerry looked up, surprised, then nodded slowly. Morty didn't rush. He simply guided him through small adjustments, pointing to subtle details and allowing Jerry to take the lead. Each small correction, each gentle suggestion was infused with quiet empathy. No loud commands, no impatience, only observation, care, and attention. By the time they finished, Jerry's expression had softened, his posture relaxed.
"Thanks, Morty," he said quietly. "I
Didn't think I'd get this right." Morty smiled gently. "You did fine.
sometimes."
It's just about noticing and letting things unfold slowly." Rick, observing quietly from across the garage, felt a rare warmth in his chest. The lessons he had been teaching were not only taking root in Morty's mind, but also shaping the subtle interactions around him. Quiet heroism, he realized, could ripple outward in ways even he hadn't fully anticipated. Later that evening, Morty lay in bed, reflecting on the day. He thought about Summer's quiet focus, Jerry's tentative success, the soft rhythms of the hill and the wind, the gentle echoes of the cosmos and the garden of echoes. He realized that the quiet attention, patience, and empathy he had been cultivating were not abstract lessons. They were tools to connect with the world and the people in it. And as he drifted towards sleep, he understood something profound. True heroism did not always roar. Sometimes it whispered. Sometimes it breathed quietly in the spaces between observation and action. Sometimes it moved gently through small acts of care, subtle attention, and quiet empathy. And those whispers could ripple farther than any explosion, echoing through the hearts of others, shaping the world softly, profoundly, and lastingly. Outside, the night carried faint breezes through the trees, soft shadows over the garage, and quiet echoes of distant lights. Morty felt the rhythm of life, the pulse of connection, and the subtle warmth of understanding settle deep within him. He knew that every small gesture, every observation, every moment of gentle care could create ripples that mattered far more than he had ever imagined. And somewhere, in the soft hum of the garage, the quiet sway of the trees, and the gentle rhythm of his own heart, Morty realized he was learning the most important lesson of all, that empathy, attentiveness, and quiet presence could transform not only his own life, but the lives of those around him. The garage was quiet that morning, bathed in soft light filtering through the high windows. Morty moved carefully among the scattered tools and machines, noticing how shadows shifted along the walls, how dust motes lingered in gentle clusters, how the faint hum of equipment pulsed like a subtle heartbeat. It felt different now, alive, intimate, filled with quiet meaning. Rick sat at the workbench, tinkering with a device that emitted tiny sparks of light. Morty watched for a moment, noticing the way Rick's fingers moved with deliberate precision, the slight furrow in his brow, the occasional quiet sigh that slipped past his lips without thought. Morty realized he had never truly noticed Rick this way before. Not like this, the quiet man behind the loud adventures, the one who carried subtle rhythms of care, concern, and thought. "Hey,
Morty," Rick said softly, not looking up.
you're observing more than usual." Morty hesitated.
I think I'm starting to notice you.
Not just your gadgets, not just the portals, but you. The way you move, the way you think, the small things. Rick paused, fingers hovering over a tiny wire. Most people never do that, Morty. They see the loud, the flashy, the dangerous, but not the quiet. They miss the subtleties of people, even the ones they care about most. Morty stepped closer, careful not to disturb Rick's workspace.
I think,
"I want to notice more.
not because I need to fix anything or impress you, just
To understand you better." Rick finally looked up, a faint, almost imperceptible smile crossing his face. It was subtle, soft, unlike any expression Morty had seen from him in the chaos of their adventures.
that's important, Morty. Paying attention to someone quietly without expectation.
That's a form of care.
And care matters more than most people realize. Morty nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of the lesson.
He moved around the workbench, noticing Rick's posture, the way his eyes flickered to the tools, the gentle hum of thought that seemed to vibrate around him. He began to sense a rhythm in Rick's movements, subtle patterns that reflected mood, intent, and emotion. For the first time, Morty felt connected not just to the adventures they shared, but to the quiet man who guided him through them. Rick leaned back, observing Morty's quiet attentiveness. Most of the time, Morty, people don't look past the chaos. They don't see the quiet struggles, the little hesitations, the moments of thought that never get spoken.
But noticing, really noticing.
That's a kind of heroism too, subtle, unseen, but it shapes connection, understanding, and trust. Morty absorbed the words, letting them settle like soft sunlight across his mind. "So, noticing you carefully."
That's important?
"Even if I don't say anything?" Rick nodded slowly.
Exactly. Words aren't always necessary. Presence, observation, awareness.
Those are just as meaningful, sometimes more. And you're starting to understand that. They moved outside into the yard, the wind brushing gently through the trees, the soft hum of life carrying across the air. Morty watched Rick walk slowly, paying attention to the way he shifted weight from foot to foot, how his hands occasionally lingered over the tools or brushed against the grass. Every subtle motion was a quiet message, an unspoken pattern, and Morty noticed, absorbing it without judgment or rush. "You're really different now, Morty," Rick said, voice soft, almost reflective.
Not just more observant.
"But more aware, noticing patterns in me, in the world, in yourself. It's a rare skill. Most people never get this far." Morty felt warmth spread through him, a quiet satisfaction mingled with gentle reverence. He realized that noticing Rick, really noticing him, without expectation, without judgment, was an act of care that rippled outward. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't dramatic, but it mattered profoundly. They paused beneath a large tree in the yard. Morty traced the pattern of shadows cast by its branches, noticing how Rick's figure shifted with the light, how his posture changed subtly as he breathed. Morty felt the rhythm of his presence, the subtle pulse of thought and motion that had gone unnoticed before. "Rick, can I ask you something?" Morty said softly. Rick tilted his head slightly, listening. "Sure, Morty, what's on your mind?" Morty hesitated, searching for words.
How do you stay so calm in all the chaos?
All the adventures, the danger, the portals.
How do you keep it together?
Rick sighed quietly, looking up at the sky. "Morty, I'm not always calm.
Most of the time, I'm barely holding it together.
But I've learned to notice, to move carefully, to respond deliberately, and to observe without rushing.
That's what keeps me grounded.
That's what I want you to learn. The quiet patterns, these subtle rhythms, they're what matter most in the end." Morty nodded, feeling the truth in Rick's words resonate deep within him. He realized that noticing Rick, the quiet patterns of his behavior, the subtle rhythms of his mind and presence, was not just an exercise in observation. It was an act of empathy, connection, and understanding. The same kind of quiet heroism he had been practicing in the garden, in the cosmos, and at home as the afternoon sunlight softened. Morty and Rick walked slowly back toward the garage, each step deliberate, each movement attentive. Morty noticed small habits, the way Rick's hands flexed when he was thinking, the faint sigh when he solved a minor problem, the way his gaze lingered on objects as though mapping them in his mind. Every detail told a story, and Morty listened quietly, without interruption, letting the presence of another human being unfold naturally before him. Back in the garage, Morty felt a profound sense of calm. The tools, the machines, the faint hum of electricity, everything carried subtle rhythms that mirrored the lessons he had been learning. And at the center of it all was Rick, quiet, deliberate, a man of complex patterns and hidden depths. Morty realized that truly noticing someone, truly understanding their subtle rhythms, was as important as any adventure, any portal,
any universe they had visited together. Rick leaned against the workbench, watching Morty for a long moment.
"You've grown, Morty, not just in skill or bravery, but in awareness,
In noticing, in caring.
That's what really matters, and I see it in you now." Morty felt a quiet pride, not loud or flashy, but steady, like the gentle pulse of light through a window. He realized that noticing Rick with patience, empathy, and attention was part of his journey too, a lesson in connection that would ripple outward, shaping both their lives in subtle, profound ways. As night fell, Morty lay in bed reflecting on the day. He thought about the quiet patterns he had noticed in Rick, the small gestures, the subtle rhythms, the faint hints of thought and emotion that often went unseen. He realized that these observations were not just acts of awareness, they were acts of care, empathy, and connection. And in that quiet noticing, he felt a bond with Rick deeper than any adventure.
Louder than any explosion. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees.
The stars began to twinkle in soft, deliberate patterns, and the quiet hum of the universe seemed to echo Morty's awareness back to him. He understood, fully and quietly, that noticing others, observing subtle patterns, and responding with gentle care was a form of heroism, one that could last far longer than any dramatic gesture or loud adventure. And somewhere, in the faint glow of the garage, the quiet sway of the trees, and the subtle rhythm of his own heart, Morty felt the deep, steady truth that awareness, empathy, and quiet connection were powerful beyond measure, and that truly noticing another person, and especially someone like Rick, could ripple farther than any portal, any invention, any loud act of bravery. The morning light fell softly over the Smith household, brushing the walls in golden shadow. Morty moved carefully through the kitchen, noticing the faint hum of the refrigerator, the slight unevenness of the floorboards beneath his feet, and the way sunlight caught the edges of the window pane. He felt a quiet sense of anticipation, though he didn't fully understand why. It was as if the day itself was waiting to reveal subtle lessons, gentle connections he had not yet seen. Rick was fiddling with a small device on the counter, the faint glow of the screens casting soft patterns across his face. "You're moving slowly today, Morty," he remarked, not looking up.
Good, it's the slow days that teach you the most.
The ones where you notice small things, patterns in people, echoes beyond your immediate presence. Morty nodded, absorbing the words. He realized that the attention he had been cultivating at home, observing Rick, Summer, and even Jerry, could extend further. Empathy, he understood now, was not limited to those he lived with. It rippled outward like the faint vibrations across a calm pond when a stone is dropped. Their first stop was the small park near the neighborhood. Morty walked slowly along the paths, noticing how the grass leaned with the breeze, how the trees shifted and whispered with quiet elegance, how the distant laughter of children carried soft joy without urgency. He saw a woman sitting on a bench feeding pigeons. The birds gathered around her, wings brushing gently against the edges of her coat, and she moved with a calm, careful rhythm, scattering crumbs with subtle precision. Morty paused, observing quietly, noticing the interaction, the unspoken connection between human and bird, the rhythm of giving and receiving that went unnoticed by passers-by. Rick watched him, allowing him the space to see. "See that, Morty?" Rick said softly. "That's a small world, a small pattern. Most people don't even glance. But it's alive and it responds to attention. She's connecting, whether she realizes it or not."
And you're noticing?
"That's important," Morty nodded, feeling warmth spread through his chest.
It's peaceful, and even small, unnoticed things. They're important too, aren't they?
Rick smiled faintly, the soft lines around his eyes showing rare calm. "Exactly. Small acts, quiet connections, subtle empathy, they ripple farther than the loudest gestures. That's the quiet heroism you've been practicing." As they walked further, Morty noticed a boy helping his younger sibling climb over a low fence. The older boy's hands were steady, his movements patient, his encouragement gentle. Morty watched for a long moment, appreciating the quiet patience, the calm guidance, the subtle awareness that made the task possible without incident. He realized that heroism was not always dramatic. Sometimes it was quiet patience, small acts of kindness, attention to subtle needs. Rick's voice came softly beside him. "Most people think heroes wear capes or carry weapons. But you've been learning differently, Morty. Quiet observation, gentle guidance, empathy, those are far more powerful than any flashy act."
And they're visible to the right eyes. The ones willing to notice. Morty continued through the park, letting his awareness expand.
He noticed the way a couple shared a silent moment on a bench, hands brushing lightly, eyes meeting in quiet understanding. He noticed a dog chasing its own tail, the pattern of its movement, a gentle rhythm that mirrored the subtle currents of life around it. Even the pigeons scattered by a passing jogger carried faint echoes, subtle reactions to the world that had gone unnoticed by almost everyone else. He began to see that the universe in miniature was everywhere. Patterns and echoes existed not just in distant cosmos or strange gardens, but in ordinary streets, parks, and backyards. Attention, awareness, empathy. They revealed the hidden rhythms of life, rippling outward in ways that were both profound and gentle. Morty stopped near a small fountain, watching the water arc into the air and return with soft splashes. The flow was rhythmic, subtle, endlessly repeating, yet never quite the same. He traced the small patterns, noticing the ripple effects as the drops met the pool, the reflections of sunlight shifting with each movement. It was like a quiet symphony, visible only to those willing to slow down, to notice, to care. Rick observed him quietly, almost reverently. "That's it, Morty. You're seeing the ripples beyond your immediate world."
Observing the patterns in people, the echoes in nature, the connections that go unnoticed.
That's a lesson most people never learn.
And now you're learning it naturally, without force, without expectation. Morty smiled softly, feeling a profound sense of calm.
It's bigger than just noticing at home.
It's everywhere. Even strangers, even small moments.
They matter, Rick nodded.
Exactly.
And the more you notice, the more your presence ripples outward. Subtle acts of awareness, small gestures of care, they reach farther than you realize. You're part of the pattern, Morty. And so is everyone else who notices. They spent the afternoon moving slowly through the park, observing, listening, and noticing. Morty learned to see the quiet struggles of people walking alone, the soft gestures of care between friends, the small acts of kindness that went unseen. He began to understand that empathy was not a singular act, but a continuous presence, a ripple that moved outward, touching the world in subtle, meaningful ways. By the time they returned home, the sun was dipping low, casting long, soft shadows across the street. Morty carried a quiet contentment, a subtle joy rooted in awareness and connection. He realized that heroism, true heroism, was not about portals, inventions, or interdimensional escapades. It was about observing, understanding, and caring, even in places no one would notice, even in moments that seemed insignificant. That evening, Morty sat by his window, watching the street bathed in golden twilight. He thought about the woman feeding pigeons, the boy helping his sibling, the quiet moments between strangers in the park. Each moment was a tiny pattern, a small echo, a ripple that carried weight beyond immediate perception. Morty felt a soft kinship with all these lives, a gentle awareness that he was connected, even at a distance, through observation, empathy, and quiet care. Rick came to check on him, voice gentle. "You've grown, Morty, not just noticing patterns at home, but ripples in the wider world. That's the skill that lasts, the one that shapes the world quietly, subtly, and you're learning it naturally, without force, without hurry."
That's rare. Morty leaned back, eyes soft, breathing slowly. I feel calm, Rick, and
Connected.
the world is full of little lessons, little echoes, and I just need to notice them. Rick nodded, a faint warmth in his expression.
Exactly, Morty. And the more you notice, the more you become a part of the quiet patterns that matter most. You don't need to shout. You don't need to act dramatically. Just being present.
Noticing, caring.
That's enough. And as Morty drifted to sleep that night, the echoes of the day carried softly through his mind, the gentle rhythm of the fountain, the quiet interactions of strangers, the subtle connections of life everywhere. He understood that heroism was a quiet presence, that empathy could ripple farther than any portal, and that noticing the subtle patterns of the world was the most profound adventure of all. Outside, the night moved softly through the streets, the wind brushing leaves in gentle currents, and the faint hum of distant life carried soft, unseen rhythms. Morty felt himself part of the quiet pulse, connected to the world through gentle observation, subtle care, and quiet awareness, and somewhere in the soft, ordinary, unnoticed moments of the day, the ripples he observed would continue to move outward, shaping lives in ways that were profound, gentle, and lasting. There are moments in history that stand apart from all others.
Moments when 1,000 voices fall into hush, and even the stars above seem to hold their breath.
The day the Emperor spoke no more was one such moment. No choir could mend him. No Primarch could shield him. No council of wise men, no legion of warriors, no vault of relics from forgotten ages could undo what was done. The throne had taken him, or perhaps he had taken the throne, and all that was left to mankind was the silence that followed. The Astronomicon still burned, its light a beacon across the void, but those who felt it in their minds swore it no longer shone with the same warmth. It was colder now, harsher, like the glow of a distant sun that could not warm the skin, only sear the eyes. The navigators whispered of strange shapes lurking just beyond the edges of that light, shadows drawn closer by its altered flame. The black ships continued their harvests. The children continued to be taken. The sacrifices continued, unending. But the hope that once accompanied those sacrifices was diminished. For once, long ago, each soul given to the throne had been offered with faith that the Emperor would one day rise, walk again, and speak to his children. Now, that faith, frayed like an old banner left too long in the storm. The high lords of terror whispered amongst themselves, each voice brittle with fear. Some spoke of succession, though the word itself was blasphemy.
Others of secrecy, of hiding the truth from the Imperium lest it fracture.
They commanded that the silence of the emperor be described as meditation, as withdrawal, as deliberate purpose. But in their hearts they trembled, and across the galaxy the sons of the emperor, those who remained, felt the wound most deeply. Robout Gilliman, the avenging son who bore the weight of duty upon his shoulders, looked upon terror and felt the weight increase beyond reckoning. Vulcan, eternal and unbroken, whispered prayers into the dark, knowing they went unanswered. The lion, returned from shadow, brooded upon the silence with suspicion, and the others, those lost, those damned, those hidden, felt the silence as accusation, as judgment, as the last word unspoken. Yet perhaps in that silence there was meaning. Perhaps the emperor, in his stillness, was offering his children the final lesson, that he would no longer speak, and so they must find their voices, that he would no longer lead, and so they must learn to walk without him, that he would no longer burn with warmth, only with cold necessity, and so they must decide whether to be more than tools, more than servants, more than pawns upon his great and endless board. The silence was heavy, but silence is never truly empty. Within it lies the echo of all that has been spoken before, and in the deep chambers of the imperial palace, where the golden throne throbbed like a dying star, that silence whispered still to those who listened closely enough. Some said it was grief.
Others said it was condemnation.
And a few, a very few, dared to believe it was trust. Trust that mankind, in all its brokenness and glory, might one day rise without the need for him, that perhaps his work was done, not in his endless sacrifice, but in the seeds he had already sown. In the end, no answer came, only silence. The Emperor's silence, and in that silence the galaxy turned, as it always had, into another age of war, of faith, of betrayal, of dreams that could never be fulfilled. Yet somewhere, in the endless night, a fragile flame endured, not because of the Emperor's words, but because of his silence. For silence, too, can be eternal. The galaxy had entered its long twilight. Empires had fallen before, and others would yet rise, but never before had so vast a dominion been held together by silence alone. The Emperor did not speak. The throne did not relent, and yet the Imperium endured, like a cathedral built upon ruins, each stone held not by mortar, but by faith across the stars. Men and women dreamed of him. Some dreamed of a saviour, radiant and eternal, who would one day rise from his throne and gather them into his arms. Others dreamed of a judge, terrible and cold, whose gaze would burn away their sins and leave nothing behind but ash. And still others dreamed of him as he had been, a man walking among men, clothed not in gold but in the dust of war, burdened yet unbowed. The black ships continued their ceaseless passage, carrying their silent cargo. For every 1,000 children who entered, none returned, their small lives given to fuel the light that guided ships across the void.
Mothers wept, fathers cursed.
Worlds screamed in protest. Yet the ships were never empty, never without their human tithe. Fear of the dark outweighed grief for the lost. Still, stories persisted. In forgotten villages, in the slums of hive cities, in the wind-swept deserts of frontier worlds, there were whispers of children who returned from the black ships. Changed. Yes, scarred, hollow-eyed, haunted, but alive. Some said these children were touched by his spirit. Others said they were mistakes, accidents the Imperium dared not acknowledge. And still others claimed they were omens, proof that the Emperor's will was not yet finished, proof that his silence was not the end. The High Lords could not silence these rumors, for rumors are as immortal as faith. Even in the most tightly controlled worlds, the dream of his return seeped through the cracks like water in stone. A single candle lit in the dark could ignite 1,000 more. But not all dreams were gentle. In the eye of terror, the gods of ruin whispered their own visions. They spoke to mortals and demons alike of the Emperor's silence, of his fading strength, of his throne cracking beneath the weight of centuries. They mocked the Imperium, and yet they feared it still, for even in silence the Emperor's shadow fell across the warp like an iron wall. His light was diminished but not extinguished, and so the galaxy was caught between dream and silence. The people of the Imperium dreamed because they could not live without dreaming. They dreamed because silence alone would crush them. They dreamed because, in the endless night of war, a dream was all that stood between endurance and despair. Perhaps this was his last gift. Not command, not decree, but the fragile persistence of hope itself. For even if he would never rise, never walk again, never speak, still, his people dreamed, and dreams, unlike empires, do not die easily. The throne endured, but those who served it could not deny the truth. The silence had grown heavier. It was no longer the silence of a slumbering god, patient and unmoving, but the silence of something deeper. The silence of an ocean that had swallowed its own voice. Tech priests whispered of power fluctuations. The Adeptus Custodes spoke in riddles of shadows where none should fall. Even the Sisters of Silence, whose lives were built upon muting the warp, found the stillness oppressive, as though some greater quiet was pressing upon them. And yet, beyond terror, beyond the golden husk of the palace, humanity carried on. Hive cities roared with the noise of billions. Forge worlds thundered with the breath of machines.
War never ceased.
Rebellion never slept. Still, in all corners of the galaxy, people looked to the sky and wondered if the Emperor still looked back. There were worlds where his light seemed to flicker. Navigators reported strange turbulences in the Astronomicon, like a heartbeat that sometimes faltered. Across the void, there were moments when the Emperor's light dimmed, and the stars themselves seemed to hold their breath. In those moments, fear gnawed at even the most faithful. But in the darkest of nights, new visions began to surface. Pilgrims spoke of dreams where the Emperor did not rise in flame or thunder, but simply sat among them as a man, cloaked in plain robes, listening. These visions were not of triumph, nor of wrath, but of gentleness, of presence,
of patience. The ecclesiarchy could not accept this softness.
They demanded a god of fire, not a father of silence. Yet the vision spread. Small cults of dreamers formed, not heretical, not seditious, but quiet. They gathered in ruins, in cellars, in deserts, and prayed not for salvation, but for companionship, for the Emperor to simply remain. On Cadia's grave, among its shattered stones drifting in the void, veterans of 1,000 wars knelt and swore that they still felt his gaze. On distant agri-worlds, farmers tilled their fields under a sun they claimed shone brighter when his name was spoken. On backwater colonies, children born aboard black ships were remembered, and their memory burned brighter than fear. The galaxy was unraveling, thread by thread. Yet in that unraveling, a strange resilience appeared. Humanity had long survived on obedience and fear, but now it survived also on something else, a dream that outlasted silence. Perhaps this was his design. Perhaps it was merely the stubbornness of the species he had once led. But even as the throne's silence deepened, the people whispered back, and, in some unfathomable place between silence and dream, something listened. The Imperium had long lived with contradictions. A god who bled, a corpse who reigned, a silence that commanded legions. Yet in the waning years of the 41st millennium, that contradiction grew sharper, for silence was spreading, and silence could not be commanded. On Terra, the Astronomicon pulsed faintly, its rhythm faltering like the breath of a dying man. The psychers who fed its flame screamed in unison, then fell still. Black ships, heavy with their burden, found themselves adrift when the beacon flickered. Some returned.
Others were lost.
The sea of souls was not merciful. But while silence devoured the warp, dreams multiplied among the faithful. Pilgrims who had never left their mud-choked villages began to see visions of him. Not radiant, not crowned in golden light, but human, seated in shadow, watching with eyes that held no judgment. Some said he spoke words they could not remember.
Others claimed he smiled.
And though no one could repeat his voice, the memory of it lingered like warmth after flame. The ecclesiarchy raged. They burned villages, executed visionaries, and silenced dreamers with the lash. To them, these visions were heresy, a softening of the creed, a distortion of the God who was fire and vengeance, and yet the dreams spread faster than flame. On shrine worlds, whispers bloomed between the hymns. Among the Astra Militarum, soldiers wrote his name into the dirt before charging into battle. Even the navigator houses, proud and cold, confessed in secret that they felt his hand guiding them when the light dimmed. The faith of humanity was no longer only the faith of priests. It had become the faith of the forgotten. Some custodians watched this change with unease. They had served him in silence, never questioning. But now, among their number, doubt began to stir. If the Emperor truly was divine, why would he appear not as a god of wrath, but as a man of patience? If he had wanted silence, why allow dreams to bloom in its place? There were those who dared whisper, perhaps this was his will. Perhaps the silence was not abandonment, but preparation. For even in stillness, something endured, not words, not miracles, but presence. And so, across a galaxy of blood and iron, humanity began to live by two truths. In the cathedrals of the ecclesiarchy, they worshipped a God of eternal fire. But in the quiet corners of their souls, they dreamed of a Father who simply watched, who endured with them, who remained even when his voice was gone. The High Lords of Terror feared this fracture, for fractures led to rebellion, and rebellion led to ruin. Yet they could not extinguish what they could not touch. Dreams had no borders, no armies, no walls. They flowed through silence as rivers through stone. The silence deepened. The throne grew colder. But the dream would not die, and perhaps, somewhere in the spaces between silence and vision, in the stillness beyond all prayer, the Emperor waited. The galaxy had grown quieter.
Not the quiet of peace, but the quiet of expectation, the stillness that follows a storm too long remembered.
Across countless worlds, those who listened carefully felt the throne's presence in subtle ways. A heartbeat in the void, a flicker in the warp, a whisper in the spaces between stars. Pilgrims and visionaries sensed it first. Small communities on fringe planets spoke of subtle guidance, crops that grew where none should have, rivers that changed course gently to nourish the dry lands, strangers arriving with answers to unasked questions. They could not explain it, only note it, a ripple in the silent sea of the Imperium, a pulse where none should have been. Even within the towering spires of terror, the High Lords noticed anomalies. Navigation charts shifted without explanation. Psychers reported dreams that seemed more vivid than their own imagination, visions of futures that had not yet unfolded. Some feared it was the work of demons, but no corruption tainted the source. The light of the Emperor persisted, though muted, subtle, almost human in its expression. The black ships continued their relentless passage, yet even among them, whispers began. A child would smile unprompted. A young navigator would pause mid-task to notice the stars, not just follow them. The small ripples of awareness spread quietly, like soft currents beneath the surface of an ocean. Robert Guilliman, ever vigilant, observed the changes with measured caution. The Imperium had survived through order and discipline, yet he could not ignore the subtle shift in the fabric of humanity's faith. Soldiers reported calm in the face of overwhelming odds, compassion in moments when survival demanded cruelty, and moments of unspoken understanding between enemies. "These are small things," Guilliman told himself, pacing the halls of the Imperial Palace. Small ripples easily overlooked. Yet if they persist, if they grow, they may yet reshape us from within. In the shadows, even the custodes whispered among themselves. "The Emperor's hand is unseen, yet it moves," one remarked, voice barely audible above the hum of the palace. And in his silence, we are learning to see more clearly. Across the hive cities and agri-worlds, across the battlefields and forge worlds, the pattern repeated. Small acts of care, subtle awareness, moments of empathy. They emerged where no one had instructed them, sparked not by command, but by something deeper. Some called it hope,
Others faith, some madness.
but all who noticed felt it, a gentle current beneath the surface of the galaxy, shaping hearts and minds quietly, persistently. Even in the eye of terror, the ruinous powers took note. Their whispers of despair and conquest faltered as mortal defiance grew in subtle ways. They could not touch the quiet persistence of these ripples, these small acts that cumulatively altered the course of wars before they began, and in that quiet, fragile, unseen work, humanity began to learn something profound. That even in the absence of a voice, a touch, or a decree, presence alone could guide, could heal, could shape the course of fate. The Emperor's silence was not emptiness. It was invitation. Not abandonment, but trust. On forgotten fringe worlds, in quiet villages, the dream persisted. Children would look up at the stars and sense a hand resting lightly on their shoulders. Farmers would rise early to find fields already tilled by the wind, as though the world itself had lent its quiet aid. Pilgrims would pray not for guidance, but for the simple acknowledgement that someone, somewhere, watched over them, and somewhere, beyond comprehension, the Emperor remained, silent, still, observing not as a god of fire and command, but as a quiet presence in the lives of those who dared to notice, those who dared to dream. The galaxy continued its turn. Wars still waged, stars still burned, empires still rose and fell. Yet beneath the chaos, beneath the fear, beneath the endless noise of survival, the quiet currents endured. Ripples of awareness, care, and subtle connection moved outward, touching those who had never met, altering destinies in ways both unseen and profound. And in that vast, silent sea, the dream refused to die. In the vastness of space, where stars burned like distant embers and voids stretched endlessly, something imperceptible began to stir. It was not a fleet, nor a voice, nor a weapon of power. It was subtler than thought, gentler than command, a presence, not seen, not heard, but felt, like the echo of a heartbeat in an empty cathedral, or the warmth of sun on skin after a long winter. Across the Imperium, in worlds far from the center of power, small moments of awareness began to accumulate. Soldiers noticed hesitation in their enemy, not to exploit it, but to understand. Navigators felt the warp pulse differently, not chaotic, not threatening, but as if something guided them softly, shaping currents in ways they could barely define. Farmers sowed fields with an unexpected instinct, seeds falling where the soil was most willing. Water finding its way to root with gentle precision. Mortals, long accustomed to the brutal rhythms of survival, began to sense something new. The dream of the Emperor's presence had grown tangible, not in fire or wrath, but in a quiet bloom of care. People paused to notice one another, to act not out of command but out of instinctive empathy. The galaxy, for all its violence and cruelty, shifted imperceptibly toward balance. Even the black ships carried this subtle bloom. Children taken in silence whispered to one another, small sparks of hope passing between them. Those who had endured horrors found themselves capable of tenderness, of noticing the smallest of needs in others, and of offering care without expectation. It was as though the Emperor's influence had returned, not in decree, but in quiet, persistent resonance. The High Lords of Terror were troubled. They could measure no fleets, no armies, no devices that bore the weight of this change. They saw only subtle variations, morale unbroken where despair should have claimed it, ingenuity rising where protocol dictated stagnation, compassion appearing where logic demanded ruthlessness. And in their chambers they whispered, wondering if the Emperor had returned. Not as a god of command, but as an unseen gardener of the galaxy. Across shattered worlds and thriving cities alike, the quiet bloom continued. Pilgrims felt it in the warmth of sun on their faces, in the faint guidance of wind through leaves, in the shared glance of strangers who had never met but understood one another in a moment of empathy. Soldiers, exhausted by centuries of endless war, found patience for one another. Psychers, burdened by the weight of their gifts, sensed a stillness in the warp that invited focus and clarity. Even the custodes, long bound by duty and ritual, felt it. In the silent halls of the imperial palace, where they had once moved like statues, precise and unyielding, they began to notice subtle patterns in the lives of their wards, in the operation of the throne, in the pulse of the Imperium itself. The Emperor's silence, once oppressive, now hummed with potential. The ruinous powers, ever vigilant, sensed this too. They searched for corruption, for weakness, for the cracks where chaos might seep. But this quiet bloom eluded them. It was not a weapon to wield, nor a strategy to disrupt. It existed in subtlety, in awareness, in the shared resonance of countless souls who, though small and fragmented, began to move in harmony without ever speaking on distant agri-worlds. Shepherds paused in the glow of dusk to notice how the animals followed their instinct, not out of fear, but as though guided by an unseen hand. In the hive cities, laborers collaborated without instruction, completing tasks with a grace that had seemed impossible under rigid oversight. Even the children, whose innocence had been tested by the black ships, played with small gestures of care, noticing one another in ways both deliberate and instinctive. The galaxy was awakening to a presence that could not be commanded, cannot be counted, cannot be destroyed. It was not grand. It was not loud. But it was everywhere, subtle, persistent, unstoppable. A quiet bloom of life, empathy, and attention, reaching across systems, touching minds and hearts, shaping actions without coercion, guiding without speaking, and, somewhere, in the center of the Imperium, the throne pulsed faintly. The Emperor's presence, silent yet unyielding, intertwined with this bloom, not as a god of flame or decree, but as a gardener who had planted seeds long ago, patiently waiting for them to grow. His silence had become fertile ground. His absence had become possibility. Mortals continued to live their lives unaware of the full extent of what was happening. And perhaps that was the point. True presence is never forced. True guidance is never coercive. The quiet bloom grew strongest in freedom, in noticing, in empathy, that chose to act because it could, not because it must. By nightfall, across countless worlds, a new rhythm could be felt.
Not loud, not obvious, but undeniable, a shared heartbeat of awareness, a pulse of subtle care, a resonance of hope that transcended the violence, the fear, the endless cruelty of the galaxy.
It was proof that even in the longest silence life could bloom. Even in the deepest darkness, presence could endure, and somewhere, in the stillness of the golden throne, the Emperor observed it all. He did not intervene. He did not speak. He did not act. But in the quiet bloom that spread across the galaxy, he saw his children begin to understand the greatest lesson of all, that presence, empathy and awareness could move worlds more than command, more than force, more than war, and the galaxy, fragile yet unbroken, continued its turn. The throne had always been a paradox, a seat of power that drained power, a beacon of light that burned those who tended it, a god whose silence was more deafening than any word he might have spoken. Those who had given their lives to its service knew the truth most intimately. The custodes, eternally vigilant, felt the years press upon them like invisible chains. Each stood unbent, unbroken, but within their heart lay the memory of comrades long since gone, fallen not to battle, but to the simple exhaustion of carrying eternity upon their shoulders. The Sisters of Silence had grown fewer. Their order stretched thin across a galaxy drowning in psychers. Yet those who remained near Terra felt a burden unlike any before. Their own silence seemed no longer theirs alone, but woven into the very breath of the throne itself. Where once they had carried their gift like a weapon, now they carried it like a shadow, an extension of the Emperor's own withdrawal. The tech priests fared little better. They spoke of systems degrading in ways they could not predict, of machine spirits groaning as if weary of their endless service. Every adjustment was temporary, every repair a fleeting reprieve. Even the most devout magi whispered to themselves that the throne seemed tired. And beyond these chosen servants, the Imperium itself bore the weight. The Astronomicon pulsed unevenly, and entire fleets were lost in moments when its light faltered. Each failure cost not only lives, but faith. How long could the lie of eternal vigilance endure if the flame flickered too often? Yet despite this inexorable decline, humanity endured. Perhaps it was faith.
Perhaps it was defiance.
Perhaps it was simply ignorance. But the more the silence deepened, the more the people filled it with their own voices. Prayers thundered in cathedrals, hymns echoed in the void, banners of his name were raised in defiance of despair. The Imperium might crumble, but the dream it carried refused to die, and still the throne sat unmoving. The Emperor's silence stretched onward, like a river without end. Those who served him asked themselves questions they could not speak aloud. Was he listening?
Did he even care?
Or had he placed upon them the weight of eternity, knowing it would crush them, and called that burden his will? No answer came.
Only silence. But in that silence, some began to sense a strange truth.
The throne was not only a prison for the Emperor, it was a mirror for humanity. The stillness it radiated showed them not what their God was, but what they had become. A people who could carry on even when hope was hollow.
A species that could build faith out of absence and meaning out of pain. The weight of eternity was unbearable, and yet humanity bore it. That, perhaps,
was the greatest miracle of all. There are trials that are spoken of in chronicles and carved into the annals of history, and there are trials that leave no mark, save for the scars they etch into the soul of a people. The silence of the throne was the latter. In the void between stars, navigators closed their third eyes and found not a guiding flame, but a trembling ember. Warp currents grew erratic. Ships became tombs adrift in black seas, their crews staring into madness as the Astronomicon faltered. For every vessel that reached its destination, another was lost. Its name never spoken again, except in mourning. On Terra, the silence pressed heavier than iron. Entire orders of scribes and savants bent themselves into deciphering omens, seeking some sign within the Emperor's stillness. Each came to the same conclusion. Nothing moved, nothing changed. It was a trial not of fire, but of absence. A test not of strength, but of endurance. The Adeptus Custodes held their vigil in the golden throne's shadow, their faces carved from stone. Yet within them simmered questions sharper than any blade. Were they guardians of a god or jailers of a corpse? Did their loyalty bind them to divinity or to an endless deception? They asked no one. They told no one. But each night, when the throne hummed low, they felt the doubt gnaw. The Sisters of Silence walked their endless circuits through the echoing halls of the imperial palace. Their null auras clashed against the pulsing power of the throne, making the air heavy with paradox. They had once been weapons against the warp. Now they felt like hollow vessels, amplifying the stillness, binding their fate to a silence they could neither break nor fully comprehend. The Mechanicum chanted prayers into circuitry, their voices metallic and cracked. Their rites grew longer, their offerings more desperate, as if volume itself could mend what silence devoured. They too began to whisper of a hidden trial, one that was not written in their canticles. The machine spirits themselves seemed to groan, as though resisting eternity's chains. Yet beyond terror, the Imperium itself was the one most tested. Faith became a battlefield. On one world, sermons grew louder, priests proclaiming that the Emperor's silence was a divine trial of worthiness. On another, heretics whispered that the throne was empty, that humanity worshipped dust. Riots and crusades, prayers and betrayals, all sparked from the same source, a silence that could not be explained, only endured. And in the warp, unseen by mortal eyes, that silence was not empty at all. It pressed like a weight upon the entities that lurked there, the great predators of the immaterium. To daemons it was not the absence of sound, but the drowning of it. Where the Astronomicon flickered, their laughter surged, but where the silence deepened, they recoiled. It was as if the Emperor's quiet was not only a burden, but a shield. Thus the trial was revealed for what it was.
Not an ending, not yet.
But a question. Would humanity endure the silence without breaking? Would they find strength not in answers, but in the absence of them? It was a trial with no judge, no jury, and no end in sight. And yet humanity bore it, staggering, bleeding, doubting, but still carrying the unbearable weight forward. The galaxy believed the Emperor's silence to be a void,
A hollow space.
an absence where once there had been fire. But voids are never truly empty. They swallow, they conceal, they shape what cannot be spoken. In the warp, the silence was not stillness. It was resistance. It was a barrier, unseen yet undeniable, a dark tide pressing outward against the immaterium. Where once the Astronomicon shone like a blazing torch, now the silence spread like a curtain of black glass. Demons raged against it, clawing, gnashing,
Howling in hatred. But when they touched its edge,
their claws recoiled, smoking, hissing, as if burned by something purer than fire. To mortals it seemed as though the light had dimmed. To the great enemies it was as if the universe itself had sharpened into a knife turned against them. The silence was a shield, but it was no ordinary shield of steel or sorcery. It was paradox made manifest. The Emperor, in his stillness, had ceased to reach outward, and yet in that withdrawal his presence condensed. Silence became density. Absence became weight. To human hearts it was unbearable, yet to the predators of the warp it was poison. The demons who lingered closest to the Astronomicon began to unravel. Their forms, stitched from hunger and blasphemy, dissolved into streams of colourless ash. Their screams carried through the warp, echoing like thunder over black oceans. The chaos gods themselves stirred, their vast gazes turning toward the quiet wound in their domain. They could not touch it. They could not consume it. For silence is not theirs to command. On Terra, none of this was seen, but its echoes reached nonetheless. Psychers across the Imperium dreamed of strange horizons, not of flame, but of endless plains of white where sound itself refused to walk. They woke weeping, unable to describe the weight pressing upon their lungs, the awe lodged in their chests. Some interpreted it as death. Others, as a promise. Among the black ships, navigators recorded a strange phenomenon. Routes, once deemed unstable, grew briefly steady, as though the silence had carved narrow corridors of stillness through the storm. Vessels that entered these paths felt a pressure, as if moving through unseen waters, but they emerged scarred less by madness than before. It was as if the Emperor's silence was not merely dimming the light, but reshaping it into hidden channels of survival. In the Imperial Palace, whispers grew among the Adeptus custodes. What if this silence was not failure but evolution? What if their emperor had shifted his form of guardianship from a blazing fire that drew enemies near to a shadow that kept them at bay? It was a thought heretical, even to consider. And yet, within their golden armor, more than one warrior clung to it, if only to steady his heart. The Mechanicum, too, began to record anomalies. Machine spirits bound to warp drives hummed in strange harmonics. Vox chant transmissions bled with intervals of pure quiet, empty of static, as if some hidden frequency aligned itself with the silence of the throne. The priests of Mars debated fiercely. Was this silence corruption, or was it proof of the Omnissiah's deeper design? Still, the Imperium remained blind to the greatest truth. Humanity suffered as faith fractured and worlds turned to ash in rebellion. They endured wars sparked by doubt, blood spilled by silence.
They thought themselves abandoned.
But far beyond their sight, that very silence was the blade keeping the warp at bay, a curtain holding back horrors they could not imagine. And yet, a shield can protect only so long.
Already the silence trembled at its edges.
Already the predators pressed harder, their hatred fermenting into patience. The Chaos gods had noticed the wound in their dominion. They would not ignore it forever. The silence was both salvation and doom. A shield, yes, but also a challenge. For what is shielded too long eventually draws every weapon toward it. And so the galaxy turned, unaware that the silence they cursed was also the silence that saved them. For the Emperor was not gone. He was hidden, and his silence was speaking in ways no tongue could yet translate. Silence is a paradox. To mortals it is emptiness. To gods it is defiance. And when the Emperor withdrew his voice from the warp, it was not only humanity that noticed. The predators of the Immaterium stirred in restless fury, for a wound had appeared in their dominion. A hollow place where their whispers could not reach, where their claws dissolved into smoke. Khorne was the first to rage. His throne of brass, towering upon oceans of blood, shook beneath his roar. Silence to him was an insult to the chorus of war. Every blade swung by mortals, every scream of dying worlds was meant to echo within his halls. Yet here, within the heart of the warp, an entire chorus had gone mute. His hounds howled, his legions screamed, but none of it reached across that vast stillness.
His fury sharpened into hatred.
Tsench, meanwhile, regarded the silence differently. From his impossible tower of change, he gazed upon the wound as though it were a puzzle, an equation unsolved. His servants flocked to him with schemes, theories woven from lies and half-truths, but even he, the architect of fate, found no thread to unravel it. For silence is not a path.
It is not a word nor a lie.
It is the absence of all these things, and thus it resisted his touch. He began to weave new plans, layers of manipulation, probing not the silence itself, but those who suffered because of it. For if the silence could not be broken, perhaps it could be made into a weapon. Nurgle sat in his garden, among rotting blooms and rivers of decay, and smiled his weary smile. To him, silence was not an enemy, but kin. For in the end, when all things fall, when breath leaves the lungs, when the final cough rattles into stillness, silence reigns. He stretched out his withered hands, letting the echoes of the Emperor's withdrawal brush his fingers. It was not the silence of peace. It was not the silence of rot. It was something older, deeper, untouchable. And for the first time, the Plague Father frowned. He knew this silence could not be embraced. It could not be infected. It was beyond decay. Slaanesh leaned forward upon a throne of flesh and excess, shivering in both delight and loathing. The silence was unbearable. It was the denial of sensation, the crushing absence of song, color, and ecstasy. For the Prince of Pleasure, every note of existence must be indulged, every whisper savored. But this silence was hunger denied, thirst without water, desire locked in chains. Slaanesh writhed, maddened not by pain, but by the void where indulgence could not reach. The silence was agony, and agony too was a kind of pleasure. Thus the four great powers turned their gaze together upon the wound. Not allies, never that, for chaos knows no unity, but each felt its dominion challenged. Each saw in the silence either a wall or a mirror, something they could not control. And so their attention sharpened. The warp itself began to tremble. Storms thickened around Terra's psychic beacon. The great rift of the Eye of Terror shuddered with unseen tides. Demon princes who had once strode unchallenged across the immaterium found their steps falter, their summons interrupted by streaks of voiceless light. And across the materium, psychers screamed as visions broke upon them, visions of four vast shadows gathering upon a horizon that was not a horizon, staring into a silence that refused to stare back. On Terra, none of this was known. The High Lords argued in their chambers, blind to the predators circling beyond mortal sight. The Custodes stood in their eternal vigil, their golden armor bright, but their hearts restless. The Sisters of Silence, moving wordless through the palace, felt the pressure most keenly. To them, the silence was familiar, but magnified 1,000-fold. It pressed against their minds, not as comfort, but as command. Some among them began to whisper, though they had no words, that the Emperor was using them still, that they were fragments of his will, scattered embers of the great fire he had banked into silence. But beyond, in the warp, the gathering shadows grew restless. For silence, though unyielding, is also a challenge, and nothing in chaos can abide a wall forever. Already, whispers spread through the daemonic legions. Great crusades of unreality began to march, not against the Imperium itself, but against the silence that shielded it. Armies of brass and blood, rivers of pus and plague, storms of endless color and flesh, they gathered not to conquer, but to claw at the wound, to batter the shield, to break the silence. It was not yet a war. It was not yet a siege. But it was coming. The silence had saved humanity from its predators. Now it had drawn all of them to its doorstep. And so the galaxy stood at the edge of a truth it could not see. That silence, once shield, may become battlefield. And when gods themselves turn their wrath upon a single wound, the wound must either break or become something greater still. The halls of the Forgotten Choir stood in stillness, their walls cracked and weary from the weight of centuries. Dust lay heavy upon the stone, and the echoes of song, once luminous, once the very breath of the Astronomicon, had long since withered into silence. Yet, in that silence, there lingered an echo, faint as the dying note of a bell, refusing to vanish entirely. The few who had survived those final years of servitude had known no true release. Their bodies, brittle and wasted, had been consumed by the burden of channeling their voices into the Emperor's flame. Their souls, if they could still be called such, had been pulled taut like strings of an instrument that could never rest. Even after death, something of them clung to the air, to the stone, to the lightless corridors of terror where they had once breathed life into humanity's beacon. It is said by some savants of the Scholastica Sicana that the choir's song was not only sound, but a living lattice, a web of resonance woven across the warp, binding countless flickers of human presence together into one unified blaze. Without their ceaseless harmony, the Emperor's fire would have guttered before its time, leaving humanity adrift in the vast and hostile night. And so the Emperor did not permit them to falter. Their throats bled, their hearts burned, their very names unravelled beneath the endless hymn. But the beacon held. For centuries after their fading, their legacy remained only in whispers. The black ship still sailed, gathering new children to feed the unquenchable flame. New voices replaced the lost ones, as though the Imperium had always intended for the sacrifice to be infinite, unbroken. Yet among the hidden libraries of terror there were texts, brittle and fading, that remembered the first choir, the ones who had given not only their lives, but their eternity, to ensure the Imperium's survival. It was in those writings that a strange and troubling truth emerged. The choir had not been merely servants. They had been chosen, shaped, sculpted into instruments with precision so cruel that even their humanity was stripped away. Some were taken as infants, their souls already marked by psychic resonance. Some were bound by ritual, their memories scoured so they would know nothing but the hymn. Some, it is said, were not even willing, but were broken until their voices could no longer resist. This was the cost of order. This was the hidden face of salvation. The Astronomicon yet burned, and so the Imperium endured. Ships crossed gulfs that would otherwise have devoured them, guided by a flame kept alive by endless sacrifice. And yet, to those who knew of the first choir, there was a question that gnawed in the silence of midnight. Was this light a blessing or a chain? For when the last echoes of their voices faded from the walls, a terrible emptiness remained, a reminder that even the most radiant song could be built upon the bones of those who never chose to sing it. And so, in the quietest corners of the galaxy, among the dreamers and the heretics and the weary, the story of the forgotten choir endures, whispered like a prayer that will never reach the Emperor's ears. A prayer not of praise, but of mourning for what is the worth of an empire if its light is purchased by the silence of its children. The Astronomicon burns still, humanity sails still, the choir is gone. But in the warp, in that vast and eternal ocean, there are some who claim they still hear it, the faintest harmony, mournful and unending, threading itself through the currents of eternity. Not a song of hope nor of guidance, but of remembrance. The song of the forgotten, the hymn that never truly died. The choir was gone, yet their absence was not complete. Their silence had weight, heavier than their voices had ever been. It was not the silence of peace, nor of rest. It was the silence of something unfinished, a silence that pressed against the walls of terror like a tide refusing to recede. Scholars of the hidden archives sometimes described it as an after-resonance. When the human throat ceases, When the lungs collapse and the heart falls still, sound dies. But what of song that has been poured through the warp, stretched across centuries, and carved into the bones of the Imperium itself? Such a song does not vanish. It lingers like ash on the wind. Some swore that in the deep halls beneath the Imperial Palace, where the old chambers of the choir had once stood, shadows of melody still wandered. No air stirred, no mortal lungs gave breath, yet the faintest tremor, like a note half-remembered, hung in the corridors. Tech priests recorded anomalies in their instruments, psychic choirs brought to their knees in sudden tears, and even the custodians themselves, unyielding as stone, sometimes paused as though something unseen brushed against their golden ears. The forgotten choir had left scars, not just upon terror, but upon the warp itself. There are whispers that the great rift between real space and immaterium, the roiling seas through which ships sail by the Astronomican's flame, still bears their harmonic imprint. That faint sorrow, that eternal vibration, was etched into the fabric of the galaxy itself, like the echo of a bell that rang before the dawn of history. But memory, in the Imperium, is a fragile thing. The High Lords did not speak of the first choir. The ecclesiarchy preached of the Emperor's unending light, but never of the children who had burned so that light could endure. Even the black ships, grim harvesters of psychers, made no mention of those who had built their path. The Empire moves forward on bones, and bones do not cry out, and yet bones remember. There are scattered tales from navigators who claim to hear voices when they gaze too long into the Astronomican's blaze. Not the Emperor's will, but softer, sadder tones, like children calling from the edge of eternity. They cannot be understood, yet they cannot be denied. Some navigators weep without knowing why. Others emerge from their chambers hollow-eyed, unable to shake the weight of a sorrow that is not their own. It is said by some renegade mystics that this is no accident, that the Emperor, in his wisdom or in his cruelty, allowed their souls to be woven permanently into the fabric of his beacon, that even in death they were denied release, chained instead to the Astronomican, their endless hymn sustaining the flame for all time. If this is true, then their sacrifice was not an end, but an eternity, and perhaps that is the truest tragedy. For the choir was forgotten by men, but not by the warp. Their voices did not vanish. They were transfigured into something deeper, something eternal.
Not guidance, not salvation, but mourning.
A song that would never be sung aloud again, but would forever haunt the currents of the galaxy. In the end, perhaps memory itself is their only monument. The Imperium builds cathedrals of stone, but the warp itself holds the cathedral of their voices, an unseen temple.
Vast and endless, where sorrow is the altar and silence is the prayer.
Those who hear it cannot name it, cannot explain it, cannot silence it. The forgotten choir endures, not in history, nor in shrine, nor in praise, but in the ashes of memory, and those ashes still fall. Like snow upon the galaxy, time moves differently in silence, not as minutes or hours, but as the slow accumulation of absence, the way dust settles upon stone when no wind stirs. On Terra, the once vibrant corridors of the Imperial Palace had grown dimmer, quieter, carrying with them the weight of centuries. Shadows stretched longer than they ought, and even the golden light of the custode seemed muted, tempered by the echo of something lost. The forgotten choir's legacy had transformed into legend, though no one alive remembered them directly. They had become whispers in the warp, murmurs among psychers, faint tremors beneath the Astronomican's unwavering blaze. Some said that if one listened closely enough, standing at the edge of the Emperor's presence, one could feel them still, an endless, mournful hymn threading through the heartbeat of the galaxy. It was a lament of absence, Not of despair, nor of regret alone, but of memory, of continuity, of a devotion that had no audience yet persisted endlessly. Those who glimpsed it in visions or in psychic resonance described it as a river of quiet sorrow, luminous yet grey, filled with faces that could not be named, voices that could never speak freely, yet resonating with an intimacy that mortals could not fully bear. Even the Emperor's silence seemed to hum in harmony with it, not in voice, not in will, but in presence. The Astronomicon burned on, steadfast and unwavering, and yet it carried within it a subtle echo of grief, proof that the cost of salvation is never light. Custodes stood eternal watch, their vigilance unbroken. But now they bore another weight, the knowledge that every flicker of the beacon, every guidance it offered, had been purchased by the endless suffering of those unseen, those unheard. And so the galaxy, in its unyielding march, continued. Stars burned, ships sailed, wars raged, but beneath it all, flowing like a hidden current, the lament endured. Humanity moved forward, oblivious to the roots of its survival, and yet somehow, in its small and stubborn defiance, carried fragments of the choir's devotion unknowingly within its very existence. Psychers who wandered too close to the Astronomicon often found themselves weeping quietly, inexplicably, as though a memory not their own pressed against their hearts. Scholars who studied ancient records sometimes stumbled upon phrases that made no sense, yet caused an ache that would not leave. In quiet corners of hive cities, children hummed melodies they had never learned, unaware that somewhere, in the deep structure of the universe, the first hymn had never truly ended. Even in the blackened reaches of the Eye of Terror, demons recoiled at a resonance they could not corrupt. The silence, layered with lament, acted as both shield and testament. Chaos could rage, could scream, could swarm endlessly. Yet the hymn's echo persisted, impenetrable and eternal, a reminder that even the smallest spark of sacrifice could withstand the devouring tides of the warp. And so, in the stillest moments, when the galaxy seemed to hold its breath, one could sense it. The end was not a conclusion, but a lingering presence. The choir's voices, the Emperor's silence, the weight of eternity, they intertwined in ways no one could fully perceive. It was a testament to memory, to devotion, to a quiet endurance that outlasted time itself. And somewhere, beyond sight and sound, the hymn continued, not as celebration, not as command, not as triumph, but as remembrance, a quiet exhalation of everything that had been given, and everything that must always endure. The galaxy moved forward, carried not by the loud declarations of power, but by the gentle, unbroken lament of those who had given all and asked nothing in return. And, somewhere, those echoes still lingered, like snow settling softly upon the stars, like the faintest heartbeat in a void too vast to measure. The galaxy, vast beyond comprehension, held its breath in ways unseen and unmeasured. Light travelled in silent arcs between distant suns, and stars whispered their slow, immutable stories to the void. Among them, terror remained, silent yet unbroken, a beacon in the dark, where echoes of lives long past persisted in the still air of the golden throne. The Astronomicon burned, steady and unwavering, its light reaching across countless parsecs. Yet beneath the brilliance lay something softer, something gentler, the quiet imprint of the forgotten choir, the residual warmth of sacrifice, the memory of those who had given not for glory, but for continuation. Their voices, though absent in sound, hummed in resonance with the Emperor's silence, threading through warp currents, through human hearts, through the galaxy itself. Even the custodes felt it in the tiniest tremor of their vigilance, a subtle reminder that duty is not only a charge to protect, but a communion with what endures beyond comprehension. The Sisters of Silence, walking their eternal circuits, sensed the weight of absence transformed into presence, an echo that was not emptiness, but a quiet invitation to witness, to understand, to honor. Chaos, with all its fury, all its guile, still pressed at the edges of this perfect silence. Demon princes surged through the warp, storms of color and hunger threatening to pierce the shield. Yet every advance faltered. The silent lament of the choir, fused with the Emperor's unseen will, remained impenetrable. Not by force, but by persistence, by the quiet power of those who had endured and given everything. On distant worlds, mortals lived and died, unaware of the immense orchestration of presence beneath their feet, in their hearts, in the currents that guided their ships and dreams alike. Yet they felt its effect in subtle ways, the instinct to help, the courage to endure, the small miracles that went unremarked but persisted nonetheless. The galaxy's vast machinery of survival, so easily overlooked, continued because of devotion unseen, sacrifice unrecorded, and silence made luminous, and so the centuries turned, and the millennia stretched onward. Every act of empathy, every tender moment of recognition or care became a note in the hymn that never ended. The choir had long vanished, yet in memory and resonance it persisted, never loud, never commanding, always present. It was the quiet heartbeat beneath all things. The Emperor remained on his throne, silent and unyielding, his presence felt but unspoken. His watch did not waver. His will was woven into the stillness, and his guardians carried forward, unbroken, unseen, uncelebrated. And in this quiet, the galaxy learned to carry on without need of spectacle or fire, understanding slowly that true strength lies in patience, in observation, in endurance, in the smallest, gentlest acts of care. And somewhere, in the infinite expanse of the universe, the hymn, the silence, the presence, and the memory converged into a singular truth, that life, though fragile, is perpetuated by attention, by love, by remembrance. That legacy is not written in stone alone, but in the faint, enduring traces of all who gave themselves wholly to something greater than themselves. And somewhere, still, the echoes of the choir's voices lingered, not in sound, not in flame, not in war, but in the quiet resonance that threads through all existence, in the way a star's warmth can be felt across light years, in the soft pulse of memory, in the tender awareness that we are watched, that we are remembered, that we are loved. And with that, the galaxy sighed,
stretching into the stars. Thanks for spending this time with us.
Sleep well.
Everything's going to be okay, man, even after silence had settled.
Even after the galaxy had learned to navigate its own heartbeat without guidance, there remained a trace, a faint vibration threading through the warp and the materium alike. It was not a sound, not a song, not a command. It was a presence, a quiet exhalation of everything that had been and everything that endured. The forgotten choir, though gone from sight and memory, lingered in resonance. Every psychic note they had ever carried, every strain of devotion and sacrifice, was folded into the currents that guided humanity. Navigators felt it as a subtle pulse beneath their minds. Psychers perceived it as a sigh threading through dreams. Even the custodes, vigilant as ever, sensed it in moments when stillness pressed so deeply that it seemed to speak. Chaos watched and tested. Demon princes surged toward the edges of this lingering echo, probing, clawing, attempting to unravel it. Yet every assault faltered. The silence, enriched by the memory of those who had given themselves completely, held fast. It was not merely a shield. It was a testament, a lattice of endurance woven from the sacrifices of souls who had never sought recognition. The Imperium, moving on without knowing why, felt it anyway. Worlds were guided through the darkness. Fleets arrived where they should, as though led by an unseen hand. Mortals acted with courage and empathy in ways inexplicable even to themselves. The galaxy moved forward because something beyond comprehension had carried it, and carried it still. In the quietest moments, when a star glimmered across empty space or a lone psyker gazed into the immaterium, one could feel it. The echo of those first voices, soft and undying, reminding all who could sense them that life persists not because of power or triumph, but because of attention, care,
and remembrance. And perhaps that is the final lesson, that silence itself can speak.
that absence can be presence, and that legacy is not measured in deeds recorded, but in the unseen threads that continue to bind the universe together. Somewhere, the echoes still linger, not as song, not as command, not as fire, but as memory, as quiet, as love unbroken by time. And somewhere, still, the galaxy breathes with that gentle rhythm stretching onward into the stars. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man. At the very edge of perception, where stars blur into shadow and the distance between moments stretches infinitely, there exists a horizon that cannot be charted. It is not a line of light nor a threshold of time, but a space of quiet reflection, a place where endings and beginnings fold into one another, and where all that has been lived resonates softly into what will be. The galaxy,
Vast and ancient, carried within it the weight of countless choices.
sacrifices and whispers of memory. The Astronomicon burned still, its light unwavering, guided not only by the Emperor's presence, but by the countless echoes of the forgotten choir.
Every note of devotion, every unseen act of courage, every tremor of love and care became part of a great, invisible tapestry.
Though history would record the deeds of empires and the clashes of gods, the true melody lay in these subtle threads, in the quiet currents that shaped existence without fanfare or claim. Even chaos, relentless and eternal, felt the depth of this quiet. Demons pressing against the edges of reality recoiled not with defeat, but with bewilderment, sensing that this silence was more than absence. It was endurance, memory, and love woven into a shield that could not be shattered by rage or cunning. Their assaults failed not because of firepower, but because nothing could undo what had already been given freely, entirely without expectation of reward and terror. In the silent corridors of the imperial palace, the custodies continued their eternal vigil. They felt it in the weight of air, in the subtle harmonics of the golden throne, and in the quiet understanding that their service was part of a continuum far greater than themselves. The Sisters of Silence, walking in ghost-like precision, moved with an awareness of the unseen threads connecting all things, the lives of the living, the echoes of the departed, and the silent guidance that shaped the course of humanity, and far beyond, in the reaches of space where light and shadow dance across voids untouched by time. Those who could listen closely sometimes perceived a gentle murmur, not a voice, not a song, not a command, but the quiet sigh of the universe remembering, honoring, and sustaining itself through the endurance of memory and love. It is in this horizon that all threads converge. The sacrifices of the forgotten, the silence of the Emperor, the persistence of the galaxy, these are not endings but continuations. Every act of care, every whisper of devotion, every quiet choice to endure becomes a part of this boundless, luminous continuum. The horizon stretches on, unseen yet present, reminding all who feel it that even in silence there is presence, even in absence there is guidance. And even in the vast void of stars there is love that persists. And somewhere, in that quiet horizon, the galaxy exhales. Stretching into the stars, it carries the memories, the sacrifices, and the quiet echoes forward into eternity. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well.
Everything's going to be okay, man.